Close your eyes and picture a medieval feast. Long wooden tables in a great hall, torches flickering on the walls, servants bustling about. A nobleman at the head of the table looking smug because he has more feathers in his hat than anyone else. You might imagine fine silverware clinking, crystal goblets shimmering, and waiters presenting dishes with a bow. Now open your eyes and forget all that, because if you were actually sitting down to dinner in the Middle Ages, your plate was more likely to be a chunk of stale bread called a trencher. Your drink came in a cup that 5 other people had already slobbered on, and your hands were your utensils. Yes, dinner was less Michelin star elegance and more finger painting with gravy. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic why dinner in the Middle Ages wasn't as glamorous as you think, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the trencher, the edible plate of medieval dining. Imagine a loaf of bread left out for several days until it became hard enough to withstand a small sword strike. That's your dinnerware. Trencher bread was typically cut into thick slabs and placed in front of each diner. Food would be piled on top, soaking into the crust until it turned into a greasy sponge. If you were rich, you didn't eat your trencher. You passed it down to the poor at the end of the meal, now soaked with gravy and meat juices. For peasants, that soggy bread was the closest they'd get to a nobleman's dinner. Think of it as the medieval version of a doggy bag, except the doggy bag was your plate. A medieval trencher was like Tupperware you could eat. Practical, yes. Hygienic? Absolutely not. Now what about forks? Well, here's the thing. People didn't trust them. In fact, when forks were first introduced to Europe, they were considered unholy, literally. A Byzantine princess who used them in the 11th century scandalized Venetians so much that a church official declared, "God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers, so if you had a fork at the table, people thought you were either pretentious, foreign, or possibly possessed by Satan." That's why fingers were the medieval cutlery of choice. A spoon was acceptable, but only for things you couldn't reasonably scoop up with bread or your bare hands. In the Middle Ages, using a fork at dinner was like showing up to a picnic with chopsticks. Technically functional, but everyone would just stare at you. Medieval tables weren't about personal space. You didn't get your own neat setting with a fork, knife, plate and napkin. Instead, you shared cups, shared trenchers, sometimes even shared spoons. This wasn't just family-style dining, it was full-on communal saliva swapping. Nobles sat in pairs and shared a trencher between them. Imagine sitting next to your cousin, cutting into the same loaf of bread plate, dipping into the same sauce, and trying not to notice that his hands hadn't been washed since last harvest. Guests were expected to be polite. Don't hog the meat, don't slurp too loudly, but boundaries as we know them didn't exist. If you were a germaphobe in the Middle Ages, you were either miserable or dead from plague anyway. Napkins as we know them weren't a standard part of the medieval table. What you did have was the tablecloth, big white and draped across the length of the trestle table. It gave an air of formality until everyone started wiping their hands on it. Yes, the same cloth that signaled dignity and hospitality was also your community hand towel. Sometimes nobles had servers bring a communal towel on a rod, parading it through the hall so guests could wipe their hands before and after the meal. This was meant to be classy, but let's face it, it was more like waiting for the paper towel dispenser to come around at a family barbecue. You didn't wipe your hands on your napkin, you wiped them on the table. Classy, in a greasy fingers kind of way. Another overlooked part of the medieval table was seating. Where you sat said everything about who you were. The lord of the manor sat at the high table, usually on a raised platform, so everyone had to crane their necks to see him chew. Important guests sat nearby, while lesser folks were shoved further down the table, or even into another room entirely. Meals were social theatre. Who got served first? Who had the better cut of meat? Who had to wait until scraps were handed down? It wasn't just about eating. It was about watching the invisible lines of power drawn in gravy on stale bread. The closer you sat to the Lord, the better your food. Sit too far down the table and congratulations, you just inherited a turnip. Now picture the atmosphere. Crowded halls, benches instead of chairs, and the constant noise of clattering trenchers, shouting servants, and the occasional dog roaming around to snatch scraps. Candles gave dim, smoky light, and the air smelled like a mix of roast meat, spilled ale, and sweaty humans. In short, a medieval dinner was not the glamorous candle-lit banquet you might imagine. It was loud, messy, and hierarchical. A carefully staged event that somehow managed to feel both chaotic and strict. Dinner in the Middle Ages wasn't Downton Abbey. It was more like a school cafeteria. If the cafeteria also doubled as a petting zoo, if you were a medieval peasant, your dining experience could best be summed up in one word: survival. Forget about silver goblets or roasted swans, because your table was more likely covered with bowls of steaming, unidentifiable mush, the occasional stale hunk of bread, and maybe, if the saints were feeling generous, a sliver of bacon. Eating was less about enjoyment and more about staying alive long enough to wake up for another day of back-breaking work in the fields. And even then, your breakfast didn't energize you, it just happened to you. Like bad weather, the backbone of peasant cuisine was a dish called pottage. Now pottage sounds charming, like something you'd order at a hip farm-to-table restaurant with candles and acoustic guitar music in the background. In reality, it was a never-ending cauldron of bubbling vegetables, grains, herbs, and whatever else could be scrounged up. Imagine a stew, but one that never really ended. The pot was always on the fire, food was constantly being added to it, and leftovers were left to simmer into the next day's batch. Carrots, onions, cabbages, leeks, peas, anything cheap, local, and vaguely edible went in. Sometimes it was thick enough to stand a spoon in, sometimes watery enough to resemble soup, and sometimes it was more of a dare than a meal. Bread was the other essential. But don't picture a fluffy French baguette or a warm bakery loaf. Peasant bread was coarse, dense, and could double as a blunt weapon if thrown across the room. Made from rye, barley, or oats, it was filling but far from delicious. In times of famine, people padded out their flour with things that were never meant to see the inside of an oven: acorns, ground-up beans, and even tree bark. Yes, medieval peasants literally ate bark bread. It didn't taste good, and it certainly didn't make you feel good, but it filled the stomach, which, to a peasant, was what counted. If you were very lucky, you might get a little protein. Meat was rare, and most peasants couldn't afford it more than a few times a year. Pigs were the most practical animal, since they ate scraps and could be turned into salted pork, bacon, or lard. But slaughtering a pig was a big deal, often tied to the winter months when the meat could be preserved in salt or smoke. Chickens might provide eggs, but killing the bird for dinner meant losing your future breakfasts. Cows were too valuable for their milk, and sheep were walking sweaters first and food second. Fish made a slightly more regular appearance, especially if you lived near rivers or coasts, though that often meant salted herring so tough it could probably survive a small war. Dairy products were more common than meat. Cheese, hard, salty, and made from whatever milk was available, was a reliable protein source. Milk itself was often reserved for children, since adults generally thought it was childish to drink it. Butter could appear on the table, but it was a luxury for many, and often saved for festival days or sold at market to make a little cash. Most days, fat for cooking came in the form of animal drippings, saved from those rare meat occasions, which were reused with the determination of someone who had no other option. As for fresh fruit, seasonal and short-lived, apples, pears, berries, and plums were eaten when available, but preservation was a challenge. Drying fruit or turning it into jams required sugar or honey, which weren't easily accessible for most peasants. Honey itself was precious, often controlled by monasteries who kept bees as part of their self-sufficient estates. So if you craved something sweet, you were more likely to suck on a carrot and pretend. Herbs played an important role in flavoring the otherwise bland daily meals. Garlic, onions, and leeks were staples, with herbs like parsley, sage, and dill grown in kitchen gardens. Salt, however, was a different story. It was expensive and often beyond the means of the poor, which meant food preservation and seasoning were difficult. Some areas had access to salt through trade, but many peasants lived lives of under-seasoned misery. You can imagine how exciting it must have been to bite into something even faintly salty. It was basically medieval MSG. And let's not forget the timing of meals. Breakfast, if it existed, was a hunk of bread and maybe a little ale. Lunch, taken in the middle of a long workday, was the main meal, usually another bowl of pottage or bread with cheese. Dinner in the evening was lighter, often just more of the same. Variety was not a concept peasants were familiar with. Each day's menu looked suspiciously like yesterday's, which looked suspiciously like last week's. The great culinary innovation in a peasant's diet might be adding a turnip to the stew pot instead of a leek. Life as a peasant meant food was always a precarious balancing act. A good harvest could mean a stomach comfortably full of bread and stew. A bad harvest meant hunger, malnutrition, and the gnawing anxiety of famine. Starvation wasn't an abstract threat. It was an annual possibility that loomed as large as the church bell in the village square. When nature cooperated, you scraped by. When it didn't, you prayed, and maybe chewed bark bread until the saints sent mercy your way. And so, the peasant's menu was less a menu and more a grim reminder of your place in society. It was monotonous, filling when fortune allowed, and entirely devoid of glamour, but it kept you alive, and in the Middle Ages that counted as success. If peasants lived to eat, nobles ate to impress. Dinner in a medieval noble household wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about flaunting status. The table was a stage, the food was the performance, and the guests were the unwilling audience forced to clap for a dish that looked more like a parade float than a meal. Forget comfort food, this was theatre food, designed to dazzle first and digest later. At the heart of noble dining was roasted game, the kind of meats peasants could only dream of. Deer, boar, pheasants, partridges, and rabbits all made appearances, carried into the hall whole, sizzling and dramatically garnished. Swans and peacocks, the ultimate showpieces, were roasted, then artfully redressed in their feathers to look alive again, because apparently nothing said bon appetit like a roasted bird staring back at you in full plumage. These weren't meals, they were culinary taxidermy exhibits, and if you were really trying to wow your guests, you might serve up something exotic like a crane, a stork, or even a porpoise, because medieval nobles considered anything that moved fair game. But it wasn't just what they ate, it was how much. A noble feast often came in courses, sometimes as many as 7 or 8, each one with multiple dishes. The first course might include roasted meats, fish, and pies. The next would bring more roasted meats, different fish, and maybe another pie. Because medieval chefs never met a pastry shell, they didn't want to stuff with something. By the time you reached the final course, you'd seen more birds and beasts than an entire forest could hold. Guests weren't expected to eat everything, of course. The point was the sheer abundance. Nobles wanted to show that their wealth could stretch not only to feeding their guests but to wasting food on a scale that peasants would find scandalous. And then there were the spices. To us, cinnamon and ginger might sound like cozy Christmas ingredients, but in the Middle Ages they were the edible equivalent of a luxury sports car. Nobles didn't sprinkle them for taste, they ladled them on like edible gold dust. Meat might be so heavily spiced with cloves, pepper, and nutmeg that the original flavor was lost entirely, but no one cared. The important thing was that your tongue burned with the knowledge that your host was rich enough to afford it. Dishes were often swimming in sugar too, another imported luxury. A roasted chicken might arrive covered in a sugar glaze, or a fish could be cooked with raisins and honey, because apparently nothing says fine dining like dessert and dinner, awkwardly colliding in the same bowl. Of course, the drink had to match the food's extravagance. Nobles had access to imported wines from France, Spain, and Italy, a clear step above the small ale peasants drank daily. Red, white, sweet, dry wine was as much about variety as it was about status. To impress even more, Lords might serve hippocras, a spiced wine sweetened with honey or sugar, often served at the end of a meal as a digestive, because what better way to finish your 15th course of meat than with a warm glass of cinnamon-flavored stomach relief? The presentation of these feasts was half the fun. Medieval cooks specialized in entremets, extravagant display dishes designed more for spectacle than eating. Entire castles made of pastry could be marched onto the table, complete with knights in sugar armor and edible battlements. Sometimes these dishes were even mechanical. Pies might arrive that, when cut open, released live birds or frogs. One 14th century cookbook cheerfully describes how to bake a pie filled with live animals, so that they would burst out at the feast, fluttering around the hall while diners screamed and servants scrambled. It was dinner and slapstick comedy rolled into one. But nobles weren't only showing off food, they were showing off hierarchy. Where you sat, what dish you were served, and even what size portion landed on your plate, all reflected your place in society. The lord and his honored guests got the best cuts, the roast venison haunch, the tender swan breast, while those further down the table made do with scraps and whatever had already been poked at by several sets of fingers. The whole feast was an edible diagram of the social ladder, and if you got stuck with the bony end of a pheasant, you knew exactly where you stood. Eating at one of these banquets wasn't always pleasant, though. Food often cooled before reaching the guests, and the heavy spice mixtures sometimes created more confusion than flavor. But that didn't matter. Nobles weren't there to enjoy the cuisine in a modern sense. They were there to perform wealth. Every dish was a declaration. I can afford spices from the Orient. I can import wine from Italy. I can make a pie explode into doves at will. If your dinner didn't double as a parade float, were you even a noble? In the end, the noble feast wasn't designed for comfort, flavor, or even practicality. It was a stage play with meat, a social ritual of gluttony and glitter meant to awe, intimidate, and remind everyone at the table who held the power, because in the Middle Ages, nothing said authority quite like serving your guests a roasted peacock wearing its own head back on like a party hat. If you lived in medieval Europe and wanted to show off at dinner, you didn't buy a bigger dining table or hire a lute player to strum Greensleeves in the corner. No, you reached for your spice box. Forget Instagram-worthy plating. The medieval flex was sprinkling something so expensive on your meal that everyone at the table immediately knew you had a bank account larger than their entire village. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, ginger, and cloves weren't just flavorings. They were edible status symbols, the Louis Vuitton handbags of the Middle Ages. To understand just how wild this was, picture a world where peppercorns were literally used as currency. You could pay your rent with them. You could settle debts with them. If you owed your landlord a little extra, you could just hand over a pouch of pepper, and suddenly you were square. This is because spices came from impossibly far away places like India, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East. Every peppercorn that landed on your plate had survived thousands of miles of land routes and treacherous seas, carried by merchants who had to deal with bandits, storms, pirates, and the occasional greedy tax collector. By the time it reached your castle or manor, that tiny little nugget of flavor was basically more valuable than a jewel. So, did spices actually taste good in medieval dishes? Sometimes, but more often than not, flavor was just the excuse. Nobles weren't dumping saffron into their rice because they thought, this will elevate the taste profile. No, they did it because saffron turned the dish a glamorous golden yellow, a color practically screaming, "Behold, I am so wealthy I can afford to dye my food with something that costs more than your cow." Spices were a way of communicating wealth, culture, and power without having to say a word. It was the medieval equivalent of driving up to dinner in a gold-plated chariot. The truth is, many medieval recipes read like a competition to see who could shove the most exotic ingredients into a single dish. A roast might be slathered in almond milk sauce, then dusted with sugar, pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. The result? A bizarre Frankenstein's monster of flavors that would probably confuse any modern foodie. But back then, it wasn't about pleasing the palate. It was about pleasing the crowd. The more foreign spices you dumped into your stew, the more your dinner guests would nod and whisper, Ah, yes, clearly this lord is a man of culture, and more importantly of gold. Of course, peasants couldn't dream of touching the spice trade. A single pinch of cinnamon could cost more than they earned in a week. For them, seasoning often meant salt, if they were lucky, onions, or a handful of herbs growing in the garden. So when they saw the nobility pouring imported ginger into their sauces, it was like watching someone casually light a bonfire with a stack of cash. The divide between noble and peasant wasn't just about wealth, it was literally baked into the food. Spices also played a role in politics and diplomacy. Kings and queens would gift them as a way of flexing their connections to faraway lands. Receiving a pouch of saffron or nutmeg wasn't just a thoughtful gesture, it was like being handed proof that the giver had access to global trade networks that you could only dream of. Wars were even fought over spice routes, with kingdoms scrambling to control the flow of pepper and cinnamon, because controlling spices meant controlling a giant stream of wealth. Dinner, then, wasn't just dinner, it was geopolitics on a plate. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about the medieval idea that spices were also medicinal. People believed that cinnamon could improve circulation, cloves could ease a toothache, and saffron could brighten your mood. So sprinkling expensive seasonings on your food wasn't just showing off, it was also a handy excuse. Oh no, I'm not wasting the annual income of a small village by dumping saffron into my soup, a noble might say. I'm just preventing melancholy. It was essentially the medieval version of calling chocolate an antioxidant to justify eating an entire bar. The funny part, many nobles didn't even know what the raw spices looked like. By the time pepper or cinnamon reached Europe, it was already dried, ground, or in unfamiliar form. Rumors spread wildly about where these mystical flavors actually came from. People imagined pepper growing on trees guarded by snakes, or cinnamon sticks being harvested by giant birds. It sounds ridiculous now, but when your only experience of cinnamon was the powder sprinkled into your stew, believing in giant bird farmers wasn't entirely far-fetched. At the end of the day, medieval spice use wasn't about making food taste better the way we think of seasoning today. It was about turning every meal into a show of financial muscle. Nobles wanted their dinner guests to feel a mix of awe, admiration, and maybe just a hint of jealousy. Which leads us to this. If your medieval dinner didn't double as a status update, were you really even trying? Or as the funny line goes, a noble didn't sprinkle pepper on his food for taste, he sprinkled it to scream, "I'm rich," without saying a word. If you sat down at a medieval table and asked for a glass of water, people might have stared at you as if you'd just requested dragon tears. Drinking plain water wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. Rivers and wells were often crawling with bacteria and waste, both animal and human, making refreshing spring water more of a gamble than rolling dice with the devil. So people turned to the safer, tastier alternative, alcohol. But before you picture entire villages stumbling around in a drunken haze, let's set the record straight. The medieval drink of choice wasn't necessarily strong, it was simply safe. Brewing ale or wine meant boiling water and fermenting sugars, which killed off the worst of the germs. Even better, it preserved the drink for longer, meaning it wouldn't spoil as quickly as a bucket of river water left in the sun. In short, alcohol was life insurance in a mug. Children, too, were included in this great alcohol experiment. They weren't sipping the frothy pints of modern craft beers, but small ale, a weak, low-alcohol brew that was about as potent as your average soda. Parents didn't raise their eyebrows at handing their 6-year-old a mug. They raised their eyebrows if the kid tried to drink plain water. Hydration meant ale. If you were sober at the dinner table, you were either a saint or very, very thirsty. And yet, not all drinks were created equal. What you drank depended heavily on your social standing. Peasants, for the most part, drank ale. It was simple, cheap, and made from barley or oats. The flavor? Think of it as earthy, slightly sour, and very, very plain. You didn't sip it for enjoyment, you gulped it to stay alive. Nobles, on the other hand, had access to wine, and not just any wine. Imported from places like France, Spain, or Italy, wine was the aristocratic stamp of sophistication. A nobleman with a goblet of wine was saying, "Yes, I have money, land, and probably a questionable hat with feathers in it." The wine itself, however, wasn't always the kind of luxurious nectar we imagine today. It could be sour, sharp, or watered down to stretch supplies. Sweetened wines, flavored with honey, cinnamon, or cloves, were particularly popular among nobles who wanted their drinks to taste like a dessert rather than grape vinegar. Serving these wines wasn't just hospitality, it was a performance. Guests weren't just supposed to drink, they were supposed to admire how the host's wealth flowed as freely as his imported casks. The commoners, meanwhile, had to get creative. They brewed their own ale at home or relied on the village alewife, the woman who made and sold beer in her household. Alewives often hung out a broomstick or a sign outside their door when a fresh batch was ready, turning their homes into impromptu taverns. Imagine the medieval equivalent of a neon open sign, but made of twigs and hope. Beer, as we know it today, with hops for flavor and preservation, didn't become widespread until later in the medieval period. Before hops, ales spoiled quickly, meaning peasants were constantly brewing and drinking. Freshness wasn't just a buzzword, it was survival. By the time hops started spreading through Europe, the drink had more staying power, and people embraced the bitter, more complex flavor. And then there was mead, the ancient honey wine. Mead held a special place in certain regions, especially in northern Europe. For peasants, it was often too expensive to make regularly. Honey wasn't cheap, but for those who could afford it, mead was a sweet, golden drink that carried mythical associations with gods, warriors, and celebration. Nobles who served mead weren't just offering alcohol, they were serving liquid poetry. Monasteries also played a massive role in the medieval drinking culture. Monks were some of the most skilled brewers of the age, producing beer and wine both for their communities and for sale. Their drinks were often higher quality than what peasants brewed in their kitchens, and the monasteries became hubs of production and refinement. So yes, the road to heaven was paved with prayer, but the pit stops often had excellent beer. And we can't forget feasts. Drinking wasn't just hydration, it was theatre. At noble tables, goblets of wine were raised in endless toasts while servers refilled them like clockwork. Drinking games weren't unheard of either. Nobles sometimes competed in their capacity to down drink after drink, proving their stamina in ways that were less heroic than they probably imagined. For peasants, communal drinking bonded neighbors together, often around the local tavern fire, where gossip and ale flowed in equal measure. The impact of all this alcohol went beyond the table. Entire economies were shaped around brewing, vineyards, and trade in drinks. Towns taxed alehouses, lords owned vineyards, and peasants grew barley and oats that ended up in someone's mug. Alcohol was both a necessity and a luxury, a daily ritual and a social event. In a world without coffee shops or bottled water, the mug of ale was the anchor of daily life. So next time you sip your filtered water or fancy latte, remember, in the medieval world, neither of those would have been on the menu. Instead, you'd be downing your third ale before noon, and no one would bat an eye. Drinking wasn't about choice, it was survival. And while today we drink to relax, they drank to live, and occasionally to pass out face first in their trencher. If you've ever been scolded for putting your elbows on the table or talking with your mouth full, congratulations, you'd have been the most sophisticated person at a medieval dinner party. By modern standards, table manners back then weren't just relaxed, they were practically non-existent. The dining hall wasn't about refinement, it was a chaotic mashup of shared dishes, slurping noises and etiquette that would make Emily Post faint on the spot. Let's start with the most important fact. You didn't have your own plate, your own fork, or even your own cup. Forget the modern concept of personal space. At a medieval table, communal was the name of the game. Food arrived in large bowls or trenchers, and you and your neighbor would dive in with the same spoon, sometimes in quick succession. If you were lucky, you got to share with someone who at least rinsed their spoon in the ale before digging back in. If not, well, consider it an early form of germ-sharing community bonding. Cups were no better. Instead of everyone having a tidy goblet, drinks were passed around the table. You'd take a swig, wipe your mouth with the back of your sleeve if you were polite, and hand it to the next person. Did people back then worry about catching something from their neighbor's saliva? Absolutely not. The only thing contagious they were concerned about was showing stinginess, because refusing to share a cup would have been considered far ruder than, say, accidentally swapping spit with the local blacksmith. Then there was the delightful tradition of disposing of bones and gristle. Today, if you gnaw on a chicken drumstick, you neatly set the bone aside on your plate. In the Middle Ages, you spat it straight onto the rush-covered floor. In fact, the floor doubled as a kind of all-purpose garbage can. Bones, bread crusts, nutshells, and whatever else you didn't want wound up down there, joining the hay, reeds, and occasional wandering dog. That last bit is important. Scraps weren't wasted, because the household animals happily cleaned up after the humans. A medieval dinner was, quite literally, half meal, half petting zoo cleanup. And don't think burping was frowned upon. On the contrary, letting out a hearty belch was often seen as a compliment to the cook. It was like a medieval Yelp review, only much louder and less optional. As for slurping, that was just efficiency. You didn't waste time delicately sipping broth when you could loudly vacuum it straight into your mouth. The louder the better, apparently. But here's the twist. While table manners may sound non-existent, they actually did have rules. It's just that the rules were very different from what we expect today. For instance, you weren't supposed to blow your nose into the communal napkin. That was frowned upon, at least by the person sitting next to you. And while sharing cups was fine, sticking your entire greasy hand into a serving dish wasn't. You were expected to break bread with your fingers, sure, but you weren't supposed to use those same fingers to fish out meat from the stew pot. That was considered bad form, even by medieval standards. The tablecloth had its own curious role. Instead of being a pristine white spread you avoided spilling on, it doubled as a communal napkin. Guests wiped their greasy fingers directly onto it, leaving behind a tapestry of sauce smears and ale stains by the end of the evening. Some even wiped their mouths directly onto the cloth, meaning by dessert time, it looked like an abstract painting in gravy and crumbs. A modern host would have a meltdown. A medieval host probably just shrugged and called it seasoning for the next feast. Now let's not pretend nobles were much better. Yes, they dined with more pomp and maybe had more elaborate spoons, but when it came to manners, the gap between peasant and lord wasn't as wide as you might think. Nobles also spat bones onto the floor, shared cups, and used the tablecloth as a napkin. The key difference? Nobles had servants to sweep up the mess afterward. If a bone landed in the rushes, some poor scullion had to scoop it up later. For peasants, the clean-up team was usually a chicken or the family dog. There was also an element of performance at the table. You didn't just eat, you made a show of it. For nobles, this meant demonstrating generosity by offering food from your plate to others, especially to guests of lower status. For peasants, this might mean waiting patiently until the head of the household had taken his share before anyone else dared dig in. Either way, the meal was less about quiet chewing and more about social theatre. Of course, manners evolved over time. By the later Middle Ages, more etiquette manuals began appearing, offering such sage advice as don't scratch yourself at the table, don't lick your knife, and don't pick your teeth with your dagger. The fact that someone had to write those rules down tells you everything you need to know about how common the behavior was. And so the medieval dinner table was a place where etiquette was equal parts practicality and chaos. Sharing was required, mess was inevitable, and the lines between normal and gross were very different from today. By modern standards, it was all appallingly unhygienic. By medieval standards, it was just dinner. A medieval dinner was half meal, half petting zoo cleanup. Imagine sitting down for dinner in medieval Europe. The firelight flickers, the stew smells hearty, and the bread is warm. But here's the catch, your dinner may not love you back. In fact, it might actively be plotting your downfall. Unlike today, where an off-smelling carton of milk gets thrown out instantly, medieval food safety standards were about as strict as a toddler's bedtime routine. Spoilage, contamination, and outright poisoning were baked right into the dining experience. The first villain at the table was spoiled meat. In an age without refrigeration, keeping meat fresh was about as easy as keeping a candle lit in a storm. Preservation techniques were limited to salting, smoking, or pickling. But even then, the results could be questionable. Salted pork might look fine, but underneath that salty armor, bacteria had been throwing a rave for days. And if you were unlucky enough to eat it, well, you might be revisiting your dinner far sooner than intended. Bread, the so-called staff of life, wasn't much safer. Grain storage was often poorly managed, which meant mold, ergot, and insects crept in freely. Ergot, in particular, was a real medieval horror. This fungus thrived on rye and could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even gangrene. In other words, one bad loaf could transform your pleasant evening into what looked suspiciously like a witch's Sabbath. Historians have even linked outbreaks of ergot poisoning to waves of hysteria, strange visions, and the occasional witch trial. Who knew that dinner rolls could double as evidence in a supernatural court case? Then there were the preservation techniques that seemed brilliant at the time but had deadly side effects. Pickling and fermenting worked well, but when ingredients were scarce, people got creative in ways that would horrify modern chefs. Soured milk, questionable fish, and mystery sausages were par for the course. The fact that humans survived at all during this culinary minefield is proof of the iron stomachs medieval people developed, or perhaps just sheer luck. But food itself wasn't the only danger. The very dishes you ate from could turn traitor. Pewter cups and lead-glazed pottery were popular for their appearance and affordability, but they had a dark secret. Acidic foods like wine and vinegar caused lead to leach into meals, slowly poisoning anyone who enjoyed them. Symptoms of lead poisoning, fatigue, stomach cramps, cognitive decline, would have been chalked up to anything from bad air to God's wrath. Meanwhile, the real culprit sat right in your kitchen cupboard, waiting for dinner. Seafood presented its own set of challenges. Without refrigeration, transporting fish inland required heavy salting or smoking, and even then the risk of spoilage lingered. Nobles, eager to flaunt their wealth with exotic delicacies, sometimes ended up paying a very different price. Imagine the irony. You spend a fortune on a shipment of eels from afar, only to find that your fancy dinner is plotting to take you out. Even milk and cheese weren't innocent. Milk soured quickly, especially in summer, and while fermentation into cheese made it last longer, contamination could still sneak in. Medieval cheesemaking wasn't an exact science. It was more of an optimistic experiment. Sometimes it worked, producing hearty, flavorful cheese. Other times it produced something that could double as a biohazard. The irony of medieval dining was that the more elaborate and luxurious the meal, the more dangerous it could become. Nobles eager to impress with exotic spices and faraway delicacies increased their risk of spoilage during transport. Meanwhile, peasants with their simple, locally sourced diets might have fared slightly better. When your diet is mostly cabbage and barley stew, at least you know the cabbage didn't come with a side of mercury. And yet, people kept eating. They had to. Hunger trumped hesitation, and dining became a gamble everyone accepted. Complaints about food poisoning were rarely documented, not because they didn't happen, but because they were so common they blended into the background noise of everyday life. So next time you wrinkle your nose at a slightly wrinkled apple or throw out yogurt that's one day past its expiration, remember that in medieval Europe the rules were simple. If it didn't crawl off the plate on its own, you ate it. And if you survived the night, well, congratulations, you won the medieval dinner lottery. If you were lucky enough to score an invitation to a noble feast in medieval Europe, you weren't just signing up for dinner, you were signing up for a full evening's worth of theatre, noise and sugar-fueled art installations that would make a modern reality show look tame. A feast was not simply about food, it was about dazzling your guests, proving your household's magnificence, and leaving everyone too overwhelmed to notice that half the venison had been overcooked. Eating was only one act in a sprawling performance that mixed music, spectacle, pageantry, and sometimes chaos. At the heart of this spectacle were the entertainers, jesters with their motley clothes and sharp tongues, musicians strumming lutes and fiddles, and jugglers who were expected to keep knives in the air without letting one fall into the gravy boat. Guests didn't just dine. They sat back while performers tried their best to keep the long, drawn-out courses lively. A noble banquet could last for hours. sometimes even stretching into days, so a steady parade of distractions was essential. Without them, half the hall would be asleep before the roasted swan arrived. And then there were the subtleties, the true showstoppers of the medieval feast. Despite the misleading name, subtleties were anything but subtle. They were elaborate sugar sculptures or marzipan constructions molded into castles, saints, animals, or allegorical scenes that made the dinner table look like a cross between a confectioner's workshop and a medieval stage play. Some were even painted with bright edible colors, creating displays so extravagant that you might hesitate to eat them, though hesitating wasn't really the medieval way. These subtleties weren't just dessert, they were propaganda in candy form, reinforcing the host's wealth, taste, and status in front of everyone, lucky enough to be invited. The animals of the feast also doubled as theatre props. Imagine being served a roast peacock, not simply as a bird on a platter, but redressed in its own feathers and posed as though it were alive, shimmering blue and green under the torchlight. This was less dinner and more taxidermy with gravy. Guests were supposed to marvel at the sight before carving into it, as if the host were saying, "See how rich I am? I can make dinner rise from the dead just to impress you." Feasts also had a political edge. When kings or lords hosted a banquet, the entertainment doubled as subtle or not so subtle messaging. A performance might reenact a famous battle, praise the host's lineage, or even sneak in some propaganda about loyalty and obedience. Imagine being a minor noble, sipping your watered wine while actors in sugar armor staged a little drama about why rebelling against your host would be a terrible idea. Dinner theater, but with real-world consequences. Guests, of course, played their own role in the evening's entertainment. Part of the fun was watching who got seated where, since seating arrangements were carefully planned to show status. If you found yourself at the far end of the hall, closer to the drafty doors than the main fire, it was a not-so-subtle reminder of your place in the pecking order. The closer you were to the high table where the lord or king sat, the more visible your importance. In a way, the arrangement itself was as much a performance as the juggling act. For all the grandeur, not everything went smoothly. Entertainers sometimes miscalculated. Jesters who insulted the wrong person could end up in serious trouble, and jugglers who dropped something sharp might unintentionally add first aid to the evening's amusements. And then there were the animals. Many noble households kept exotic pets like monkeys, which were occasionally included in the festivities. That sounds charming until the monkey decided to steal food from the table or hurl something unspeakable at the guests. In those moments, the line between feast and fast blurred completely. All of this, performances, sugar castles, re-feathered peacocks, pet monkeys, served a larger purpose, to overwhelm guests with the sheer spectacle of it all. The noble host was putting on a show that said, "Look at what I can do," and by extension, "Look at how powerful I am." Feasts weren't just meals. They were living, breathing advertisements for wealth and dominance, with the food acting as one ingredient in a much larger recipe of pageantry. Dinner entertainment could range from a lute performance to watching your host's pet monkey throw things at the juggler. If you thought medieval food choices were based on taste, cost, or convenience, think again. In medieval Europe, the kitchen had another boss to answer to: the church. Religion was baked into daily life, and that included your dinner plate. What you ate, when you ate it, and how much of it you could eat, was all under the watchful eye of both God and your local priest. Forget about meatless Mondays. Try more than 100 meatless days a year. The medieval calendar was practically a crash course in dietary restriction. There were fast days, feast days, saints' days, Lent, Advent, and a wide variety of holy observances that meant you were told exactly what was allowed on your plate. The general rule: no meat on fast days. Now, before you imagine starving monks chewing on lettuce, let's clarify, fasting didn't mean skipping meals. It meant abstaining from certain foods, especially red meat, dairy, and animal fats. You could still eat, you just had to get creative, and boy did they get creative. The church's biggest carve-out was fish. Fish was considered spiritually acceptable, perhaps because it lived in water, which somehow made it less sinful than animals that grazed on land. Thus, on fasting days, your medieval diet transformed into an all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. Cod, herring, salmon, and eel were popular staples. But the real stars of the medieval fast were the weirder creatures, lampreys, slimy, jawless eels that looked like something you'd use to frighten your children into behaving. Nobles loved lampreys, especially when drenched in spices to disguise their earthy, muddy flavor. King Henry I of England reportedly adored lampreys so much that they killed him. He supposedly died after eating a surfeit of lampreys, which is possibly the least glamorous way to go. For peasants, fasting days were trickier. Salted herring was the standard go-to, especially in Northern Europe, where barrels of the stuff flooded markets. It was cheap, abundant, and long-lasting. But after your 50th herring in a row, you might start questioning your spiritual priorities. Southern Europeans had it a little better, with access to fresh fish from the Mediterranean. Still, after a month of Lent, most medieval Christians were probably praying less for forgiveness and more for variety. The church didn't stop at simply banning meat. Fasting rules were an entire social event. Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, was a serious season of dietary discipline, where even eggs and dairy were forbidden. To cope, cooks devised elaborate substitutes. Almond milk became the go-to dairy alternative, used in everything from soups to desserts. It was so popular during fasts that it became a medieval version of oat milk lattes. Trendy, expensive, and slightly smug. Wealthy households leaned on their cooks to turn these restrictions into an opportunity to show off. You might not be allowed to serve roast beef, but you could present a glorious almond milk custard shaped like a rabbit and smile piously while your guests gasped in admiration. Monasteries took fasting extremely seriously, but that didn't mean they weren't inventive. Monks were masters of turning loopholes into gourmet traditions. In some coastal monasteries, the line between fish and not fish got very blurry. Beavers, for example, were considered acceptable because their tails were scaly and aquatic. Yes, you read that right. Medieval monks classified beaver tails as fish. Similarly, in some places, puffins, which live by the sea, also counted as fish. If you think your local vegan cafe stretches definitions today, medieval theology beat them to it by centuries. Of course, fasting was also about social control. The rules reminded everyone that the church was in charge of not just your soul but also your stomach. Imagine living in a world where your diet wasn't set by nutritionists or personal trainers but by theology. If you broke the rules, say, sneaked some bacon on a fast day, you weren't just guilty of gluttony, you were sinning. It was spiritual contraband, with eternal consequences, a guilty conscience and possibly eternal damnation. Now that's a high price for a pork chop. For nobles, fasting also became a stage for competitive piety. Just as they showed off wealth with exotic spices on regular days, on fast days they flaunted elaborate fish dishes. Picture a fasting feast where the centerpiece was a lamprey pie, decorated with elaborate sugar sculptures, surrounded by almond-based delicacies, and washed down with wine. The irony was thick. Fasting was supposed to be about restraint and humility, but medieval nobles turned it into yet another round of culinary one-upmanship. Meanwhile, the poor stuck to simpler fare, salted fish, vegetable soups, and maybe some stale bread. For them, fasting was less about changing the menu, and more about continuing the eternal struggle to put anything edible on the table at all. The irony. While nobles groaned over creative almond custards, peasants were probably closer to the spirit of fasting through sheer necessity. Still, the church's dietary rules shaped medieval cuisine profoundly. Without them, the spread of fish markets, the popularity of almond milk, and the creative workarounds of medieval cooks might never have developed in the same way. Even today, echoes remain. Fish on Fridays, vegetarian Lent dishes, and religious fasting traditions all trace back to this medieval balancing act between faith and appetite. The funny thing, medieval religion didn't stop gluttony, it just redirected it. Instead of feasting on beef, you feasted on eels. Instead of cream, You splurged on almond milk custards. As the saying could have gone, if you can't eat the pig, at least you can pretend your fish pie is holy. Medieval religion didn't ban gluttony, it just made sure you sinned with fish instead of bacon. If you picture a medieval feast, you probably imagine something straight out of a fantasy epic, long wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted boars, goblets overflowing with spiced wine, and platters piled high with golden bread, all consumed under the glow of candlelight while minstrels play in the background. Reality, however, was far less glamorous. A medieval banquet might have looked impressive from a distance, but once you got close enough to actually eat the food, or worse, taste it, the cracks in the illusion started to show. For starters, most dishes were cold by the time they made it to the table. Kitchens were often separate buildings from the main hall, partly to reduce fire risk and partly to keep the smells and occasional smoke away from the nobility. This meant that food had to travel across courtyards and through draughty hallways before reaching guests. The roasted swan that once looked majestic when it left the spit was often lukewarm, if not outright tepid, by the time a servant plopped it onto your trencher. The steam rising from a golden feast image belongs more to movie magic than to actual medieval reality. Then there was the seasoning problem. As we've already seen, spices weren't primarily about taste, they were about status. A dish that could have been enjoyable with a modest pinch of cinnamon or saffron instead got buried under mountains of both. Think of it like your friend who discovers hot sauce for the first time and then drenches every meal in it until you can't tell whether you're eating scrambled eggs or napalm. The goal wasn't balance or flavor, it was extravagance. The more spices you could cram into one dish, the more people would gasp at your wealth. Whether or not anyone could still taste the meat underneath was a secondary concern. And then there was staleness. Bread, for example, was rarely served fresh and fluffy. The nobility ate what were called manchets, refined loaves made with white flour, but even these were often a day or two old. Sometimes, bread wasn't even intended to be eaten, it was used as a plate. These edible trenchers absorbed the juices of the meal, and when the feast was over, the sodden hunks were either thrown to the dogs or given to the poor. If you actually ate your trencher at the table, it probably said less about your hunger and more about your lack of noble training. Even the so-called centerpiece dishes had a touch of the ridiculous. Peacocks, swans, and sometimes even hedgehogs, yes, hedgehogs, were roasted and then redressed in their feathers or spines to make them appear more lifelike on the table. It sounds extravagant, but let's be real. The food was almost certainly dry, stringy, and more photogenic than edible. Guests weren't really expected to tuck into the bird. The point was to look at it and be impressed. The medieval version of scrolling past a glamorous dish on Instagram, but never trying to cook it yourself. And don't forget the logistics of a feast. A banquet for dozens or even hundreds of guests meant serving food in enormous portions, which didn't always equal quality. Large cuts of meat weren't evenly cooked, and massive pies could be more dough than filling. Dishes were often prepared in advance, meaning they lingered before being served. By the time you got your share, you might be eating a pie that had cooled into a dense brick, or a hunk of beef that was tough enough to test your dental insurance if medieval dentistry were even a thing. Yet, despite the lukewarm, overspiced, and occasionally stale offerings, banquets were not about culinary satisfaction. They were political theatre. Who you sat next to mattered more than what you ate. Seating charts were meticulously planned to reflect hierarchy, alliances, and subtle snubs. Being placed close to the lord of the manor or king was a badge of honor. Being tucked into a dark corner near the door said something very different. The food was the backdrop, but the real feast was in the gossip, negotiations and power plays happening across the table. What's more, showing restraint was just as important as indulging. Gorging yourself in front of others could make you look greedy, undisciplined, or worse, unworthy of your noble station. You weren't supposed to lick your fingers, shovel food into your mouth, or hoard trenchers. The ideal guest was one who picked delicately at their food, laughed at the right moments, and remembered that the whole evening was essentially a live-action resume. The illusion of glamour also extended to music and entertainment. Jesters, minstrels, and performers distracted guests from the underwhelming flavors on their plates. A sugar sculpture shaped like a castle could dazzle you into forgetting that your venison stew tasted like cinnamon soup. The food was only one layer of the performance. The real richness of a banquet was measured in how well it impressed and distracted. So, when you think about it, the medieval banquet wasn't really about eating at all. It was about surviving the experience with your dignity and stomach intact. Yes, you'd leave full, but probably not satisfied. You'd be stuffed with political obligations, smoky wine, and stories to tell about the monkey that almost stole the roasted boar's head. The meal wasn't nourishment, it was theatre, networking, and status rolled into one lukewarm stew. As the saying might have gone, medieval dinner wasn't about eating well. It was about surviving the food and leaving with your reputation intact. If you've ever used the phrase "from here to Timbuktu," you probably imagine some mythical dot on a map at the far edge of civilization, a place so remote it may as well be on the moon. But here's the twist. Timbuktu is very real, and for centuries it wasn't a forgotten speck, but one of the world's most dazzling crossroads of trade, culture, and scholarship. The city was like a desert-born celebrity, mysterious, magnetic, and surrounded by gossip that only made it more legendary. Let's start with location, because geography is destiny. Timbuktu sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert, right where the desert sands meet the greener lands of the Niger River. Imagine a gigantic highway intersection, but instead of asphalt and rest stops, you've got camel caravans, nomadic tribes, and the occasional sandstorm that would rearrange your campsite like a cosmic house cleaner. Merchants coming from North Africa with goods like salt and cloth would stop there. Traders from sub-Saharan Africa carried gold, ivory, and slaves. If you wanted to make money in the medieval world, Timbuktu was like the international airport terminal. You just had to survive the turbulence of the Sahara to get there. The city itself rose from humble beginnings in the 12th century. According to legend, it started as a seasonal settlement where nomadic Tuareg people parked their camels and built storage huts. One of the first caretakers of these huts was a woman named Buktu, so the town literally became known as the place of Buktu. If you think your neighborhood being called Bob's gas station sounds odd, just imagine living in a place named after someone's storage unit manager. But this humble campsite was about to level up big time. Why? 3 words. Location. Location, location. Timbuktu wasn't sitting on a gold mine itself. Rather, it was the ultimate middleman. To the south lay the gold-rich lands of the Mali Empire, where rivers sparkled with dust worth more than your entire medieval wardrobe. To the north, the vast markets of the Mediterranean world, hungry for that gold and willing to exchange salt, textiles, and horses. And in between stood Timbuktu, like a bouncer deciding who got in and who didn't. Spoiler, everyone wanted in. Now let's talk about the camels, because if Timbuktu was the medieval Vegas, the camel was the VIP limo service. Without camels, Timbuktu wouldn't have existed. These desert ships could carry loads of salt slabs, water, and luxury goods across thousands of miles of blistering sand. You know how modern travelers complain about airline baggage fees? Try dragging 200 pounds of salt through 110-degree heat. The camel made it possible, though it wasn't exactly first-class travel. Camels spit, they smell like the inside of a wet rug, and they have a bad habit of glaring at you like you owe them money. But without them, there would have been no gold, no trade, and no Timbuktu. What made the city truly magnetic wasn't just its economic role, it was the mythos. Word of Timbuktu spread across Europe through second-hand tales told by traders, adventurers, and occasional liars. Europeans heard stories of a city where gold dust practically carpeted the streets, where kings drank from goblets heavy enough to double as gym weights, and where libraries overflowed with wisdom while markets overflowed with treasure. Did Europeans exaggerate? Absolutely. Was Timbuktu still incredibly wealthy and dazzling? Also yes. It was like hearing rumors of El Dorado, only this time the place actually existed. And it wasn't just Europeans who were fascinated. In the Arab world, Timbuktu's reputation for wealth and learning turned it into a destination for scholars and merchants alike. The desert may have been harsh, but the promise of Timbuktu made the journey irresistible. Sandstorms, dehydration, bandits and camels that looked like they wanted to unionize against their masters. All of these were risks worth taking if it meant reaching the fabled city. Here's the thing. People often imagine medieval Africa as isolated, but Timbuktu proves just the opposite. It was plugged into global trade networks stretching from Spain to India. When caravans rolled in, they brought not just goods but ideas, languages and styles. The city's markets buzzed with everything from Berber merchants haggling in Arabic to West African traders carrying goods on their heads, to scholars debating theology under the shade of mud brick mosques. If cities were parties, Timbuktu was the one where you needed a password to get in, but once inside you'd leave with your pockets lighter and your brain fuller. The funny part is, for centuries people outside Africa doubted Timbuktu even existed. The name became shorthand for somewhere impossibly far away. But for the merchants, rulers and scholars of the medieval world, Timbuktu was the opposite of nowhere. It was the very definition of somewhere. So yes, Timbuktu was real, very real. It wasn't a mirage, shimmering in the desert heat. It was a city of mud brick houses, bustling markets, and a reputation that could make merchants risk life, limb and camel spit to reach it. Think of Timbuktu as the medieval world's Vegas, except instead of casinos, it had camels, lots of camels, and while the house always wins in Vegas, in Timbuktu, the house was full of gold dust, salt slabs, and stories that would echo around the world for centuries. If you thought your millionaire neighbor was impressive, imagine a man so rich he made entire nations question their life choices. Enter Mansa Musa, the 14th century emperor of the Mali Empire, a man whose wealth was so absurd that historians still argue over the numbers. Some estimates put his net worth at an eye-watering $400 billion in today's money. Now, you might be wondering, why would anyone haul so much gold across the Sahara? Well, part of it was religious devotion, but part of it was also political theatre. Think of it as a medieval flex. Look at Mali, look at me. Your kingdom's currency? Weak. My gold? Eternal. Mansa Musa wasn't shy about showing off, and let's just say he did it in style. He distributed gold along the route, gave lavish gifts to sultans, and ensured everyone along the way knew exactly how wealthy he was. The effect on Timbuktu was immediate. Before Mansa Musa, the city was already a growing center of trade, but this pilgrimage catapulted it into global consciousness. Timbuktu went from being a desert crossroads to a city synonymous with wealth. Word spread fast. Merchants, scholars, and adventurers from across Africa and the Arab world suddenly had Timbuktu circled on their mental maps. It became the destination for those chasing riches, knowledge, or let's be honest, a bit of both. But here's where the story gets wild. You see, Mansa Musa didn't just carry gold, he spent it extravagantly. When he passed through Cairo on his way to Mecca, he distributed so much gold that he literally caused the local economy to wobble. Gold, which had been relatively scarce and valuable, suddenly flooded the market. Prices plunged, inflation skyrocketed. Craftsmen, merchants, and bankers all looked around like, wait, is gold worthless now? And panicked. Mansa Musa didn't just flex, he broke entire economies by making it rain. Economists today would call it a shock to the financial system. In 1324, they probably just called it what the heck just happened. Back in Timbuktu, the ripple effects were profound. Merchants who had connections to Mali suddenly found their trade routes humming. Scholars arrived, curious to see the city that had produced the world's richest man. The gold trade intensified. Timbuktu's reputation as a hub of wealth was cemented, and its streets probably smelled faintly of ambition mixed with the occasional camel. And that desert smell that never leaves. Mansa Musa also used his gold as a diplomatic tool. He funded mosques, madrasas, and public works along his route. When he returned from Mecca, he brought back scholars, architects, and teachers, further boosting Timbuktu's status as a center of learning. So yes, gold wasn't just glittering bling. It was a vehicle for culture, politics, and urban transformation. Timbuktu became not just rich but respected, a city that could host scholars debating theology one minute and merchants haggling over gold dust the next. And let's not forget the human side of all this opulence. Imagine being a common trader or craftsman in the Mali Empire at the time. One day you're scraping by, and the next, your city is buzzing with excitement because the richest man in history just strutted through, throwing gold like confetti. People probably spent weeks picking up nuggets that fell off camels. Some historians even suggest that ordinary citizens suddenly had to recalibrate what wealth even meant. Oh, your house has a roof? Cute. Mansa Musa just gave away a ton of gold to random strangers on the street. Mansa Musa's Hajj wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a global event. Timbuktu's place in history was forever linked to the man who could make economies tilt with a generous hand. And while Mansa Musa himself eventually faded into legend, the wealth he flaunted, the scholars he attracted, and the roads he paved ensured Timbuktu would remain the world's buzzword for luxury, trade, and brilliance. In short, Timbuktu didn't just benefit from its geography or trade networks. It benefited from one man's flair for the dramatic. A pilgrimage became a statement. Gold became a medium for influence, and a city at the edge of the Sahara went from obscure desert outpost to center of the world's imagination. So next time someone complains about inflation, remind them it could be worse. You could be Cairo in 1324. Wondering why suddenly your gold isn't making you feel rich anymore. Meanwhile, in Timbuktu, traders and scholars were probably grinning, rubbing their hands together and thinking, "Ah yes, Mansa Musa came. Life just got very interesting." When most people think of wealth in medieval Africa, gold immediately springs to mind. Glittering, irresistible, the ultimate status symbol. But Timbuktu had a secret weapon just as powerful. And it was not shiny or precious in the usual sense. It was salt, yes, that humble crystalline mineral sitting in your shaker at the dinner table. To the people of West Africa in the Middle Ages, salt was life. Without it, food would be bland, bodies would fail, and entire economies could crumble. Timbuktu thrived on it, which is why historians often call it white gold. Salt's value was not just culinary, it was medicinal, preservative, and even spiritual. Before refrigeration, salt was the ultimate preservative, keeping meat and fish edible for months in a sweltering desert climate. Too little salt? You'd risk malnutrition, or worse. Too much salt? Well, then you were probably a very crunchy human, but that was a rare problem. Either way, the commodity was essential, and control over it meant power. Timbuktu's merchants understood this, and they made sure the rest of the world knew it too. The journey of salt to Timbuktu reads like a desert adventure novel. The famous salt mines of Tagaza, hundreds of miles to the north in the Sahara, produced enormous slabs of pure sun-hardened salt. Miners carved these blocks by hand, often in unbearable heat, then loaded them onto camel caravans for the perilous trek south. Imagine carrying a block of salt heavy enough to make your gym crush look like a joke, across thousands of miles of shifting sand, and then repeat, day after day, through blinding sun, sandstorms and bandit territory. No modern logistics company would dare attempt it. These caravans were not casual strolls, they were lifelines. Thousands of camels formed long twisting lines across the desert, each loaded with slabs of salt as big as coffins. The animals plodded steadily, their bellies packed with provisions, their feet kicking up clouds of Sahara dust that smelled faintly of desperation and camel musk. Guides led the caravans along well-worn desert tracks, known only to nomads who could read sand patterns like Braille. If a camel went missing, it wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It could mean the loss of several tons of salt, livelihoods destroyed, and angry merchants with very sharp knives. Salt wasn't just transported south for survival. It was a cornerstone of Timbuktu's economy. People traded it for gold, ivory, and slaves, or simply hoarded it for influence. A wealthy merchant in Timbuktu might own several tons of salt, stacked like medieval Lego blocks. each slab more valuable than a small house in a neighboring village. Some sources suggest that the price of salt could fluctuate wildly depending on supply, desert conditions, or even rumors of bandit activity. Salt was so valuable that people treated it like Wi-Fi. You didn't realize how much you needed it until it was gone. Timbuktu's markets would have been a sensory overload. Piles of gleaming salt blocks stacked beside heaps of gold dust, richly woven textiles fluttering in the wind, and merchants shouting in a dozen languages trying to out-haggle each other. Salt slabs could be broken up and measured like coins, traded for necessities or luxury goods, and even used as gifts to curry favor with visiting dignitaries. Two Europeans hearing about it for the first time. This must have seemed almost magical. A city where ordinary white crystals were treated as currency, and where wealth was measured in cubic tons of something that elsewhere seasoned your dinner. The role of camels in this salt trade cannot be overstated. These desert ships carried the weight of entire economies, traversing terrain that would make modern trucks break down in horror. Without camels, Timbuktu's salt economy would collapse. With them it thrived. Merchants relied on the animals' stamina and survival instincts, knowing that a single lost camel could mean days of backtracking through the desert with nothing to show for it. Camels became so crucial to the trade that they were almost a form of currency themselves. Owning a well-trained, healthy camel was like owning a small fortune with legs. Salt also shaped Timbuktu socially and politically. Controlling the flow of salt meant controlling influence. City leaders could leverage it to gain loyalty, reward scholars, or enforce trade monopolies. Families who dominated the salt trade gained wealth and prestige, building mud brick homes with courtyards, fountains, and libraries, staking their claim not just in the market, but in the cultural fabric of the city. Salt was literally foundational. Without it, Timbuktu might have remained just another dusty desert settlement. With it, the city became a hub of power, knowledge, and ambition. And yet, for all its strategic importance, salt had its dangers. The journey across the Sahara was harsh, and bandits often attacked caravans, leaving merchants stranded with nothing but a cloud of sand and the bitter taste of failure. Heat stroke, dehydration, and camel rebellions were real risks, and even when the salt reached Timbuktu, it had to be guarded against theft and spoilage. Imagine stacking all your wealth in giant white blocks and then sweating bullets every time someone walked by. It's a high-stakes game, and Timbuktu's merchants played it with flair. So the next time you casually sprinkle salt on your fries, remember this. For centuries, salt was literally gold, the backbone of Timbuktu's prosperity, and the reason camel caravans risked their humps in the desert. The city rose and thrived because people understood that while gold dazzled, salt sustained. And in the end, the Sahara itself became a vault, hiding the white treasures that kept the desert city alive, bustling and dreaming. When most people think of great centers of learning in history, names like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna pop up immediately. Timbuktu? Rarely. And yet, for centuries, it was a city where the brightest minds of the medieval world gathered, debated, and wrote manuscripts that would make today's libraries look like cluttered closets. Timbuktu was Africa's Oxford, a hub of scholarship where knowledge was not just treasured, it was a currency of its own. At the heart of this intellectual explosion was the Sankore University, a place that combined a mosque, a classroom, and a library into a single sprawling complex. Scholars came from near and far to study astronomy, medicine, theology, mathematics, and law. The city wasn't just about memorizing facts, it was about critical thinking, debate, and interpretation. Students would sit under shaded courtyards, quills in hand, copying manuscripts and debating the finer points of legal codes, philosophical questions, or the medicinal properties of local herbs. If you thought exams were stressful today, imagine defending your thesis in front of a professor who could quote from the Quran, Aristotle, and an obscure West African mathematician all in one breath. And oh, the manuscripts! Timbuktu housed an estimated 700,000 written works at its peak. That's right, 700,000. For context, imagine trying to count them all while dodging sandstorms and carrying a goat on your back for no reason. Scholars meticulously copied texts by hand, sometimes embellishing them with intricate calligraphy and geometric designs. Forget dusty college libraries. Timbuktu's scholars wrote so many books that students probably had the medieval version of overdue fines. And unlike today's digital files, these manuscripts were delicate, requiring careful handling, storage, and protection from termites, water, and the occasional ambitious camel. The manuscripts covered a mind-boggling range of topics. Medicine manuals explained how to treat everything from malaria to snake bites. Legal texts outlined complex rules governing trade, marriage, and contracts. Poetry and literature captured the city's rich oral traditions. Astronomy guides taught scholars how to read the stars, navigate the desert, and calculate the timing of religious rituals. Each manuscript was a piece of intellectual gold, more lasting than any slab of the Mali Empire's famous mineral wealth. In a very real sense, knowledge was Timbuktu's true treasure. The city attracted scholars from across Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Learning in Timbuktu wasn't limited to an elite few. Ambitious students could study under renowned professors for years, traveling vast distances with little more than their manuscripts, ink, and a dream. Teachers sometimes traveled as well, sharing expertise across regions, helping the city evolve into an intellectual nexus that bridged cultures and continents. For a medieval student, Timbuktu wasn't just a place to learn, it was a passport to the world of ideas. Timbuktu's streets were alive with intellectual debate. Markets buzzed not only with merchants haggling over gold and salt, but with scholars discussing theology, mathematics, and poetry. Imagine walking past a spice stall and overhearing someone arguing about the best method for calculating lunar cycles, while another person recites a poem so moving it brings tears to your eyes. The city blended commerce and culture seamlessly, proving that knowledge and wealth could coexist, even if one tended to outlast the other. The process of copying manuscripts was a laborious and sacred task. Each page had to be carefully inscribed using ink made from natural dyes, then dried in shaded courtyards to prevent smudging. Mistakes could mean hours of tedious corrections, which made the task both mentally and physically demanding. Some manuscripts were so ornate they could double as works of art. Think of it, while a European knight was polishing his sword, a Timbuktu scholar was polishing ideas that might survive for centuries. Timbuktu also valued libraries and private collections. Wealthy families often safeguarded manuscripts, passing them down through generations. Some homes stored entire private libraries in clay jars or specially designed shelves. Families took such pride in their collections that disputes over ownership were as fierce as battles for gold elsewhere. Scholars visiting these libraries had access to works that were sometimes hundreds of years old, and occasionally even lost in other parts of the world. The city became a living archive, a testament to human curiosity, discipline, and imagination. Even as outside eyes often focused on Timbuktu's material wealth, gold, salt, and trade, the real power lay in its intellectual capital. Scholars, students, and families who nurtured the city's libraries knew something the casual observer didn't. Ideas last longer than coins, debates outlive dynasties, and knowledge can travel further than caravans. In many ways, the manuscripts of Timbuktu were a form of insurance against oblivion, ensuring that centuries later the world would remember that this desert city was once a beacon of learning. So, the next time you think of Africa's historical contributions to global culture, remember Timbuktu, not for the gold it traded or the caravans it hosted, but for the wisdom it preserved. A city where scribes wielded quills instead of swords, where libraries were more important than castles, and where knowledge truly shone brighter than any treasure. And somewhere in the background, a medieval student probably muttered about overdue manuscripts while trying to keep a camel from nibbling the corner of his latest assignment. When most people imagine medieval treasure, they picture piles of gold coins, jeweled crowns, or chests overflowing with silver. Timbuktu had treasure too, but instead of clinking coins, its wealth whispered on parchment. Families in Timbuktu took the city's intellectual riches seriously, guarding manuscripts as if they were family jewels, and in many ways they were. Inheritance in Timbuktu wasn't just about who got the livestock or the house, it was about who got the manuscripts. And believe me, these weren't your average bedtime stories. The manuscripts covered everything imaginable: astronomy, medicine, law, history, theology, poetry, mathematics. Even farming techniques made it onto parchment. Some texts contained practical knowledge, how to calculate irrigation schedules along the Niger River, or the medicinal properties of local herbs. Others were purely philosophical or poetic, exploring ideas about justice, morality, and the human condition. Families who possessed these texts didn't just hold property, they held entire worlds of knowledge. Imagine inheriting a priceless book about math when you were secretly hoping for grandma's gold jewelry. Some children must have been equal parts awestruck and deeply disappointed. Because the manuscripts were so valuable, families went to great lengths to protect them. Special clay jars, wooden chests, and mud brick shelves were constructed to keep the delicate pages safe from humidity, pests, and prying eyes. In some cases, manuscripts were hidden in secret compartments behind walls or under floors. If you were a visitor, you might think you were entering a normal home until you accidentally tripped over a manuscript stash hidden beneath a pile of rugs. Some families took secrecy so seriously that they would only allow a trusted scholar to handle the books, and even then the scholar had to swear an oath not to copy or reveal their contents without permission. The manuscript culture created a fascinating dynamic. Knowledge was simultaneously public and private. Scholars traveled from one household to another, often staying for months, studying and teaching. Families gained prestige by hosting scholars and providing access to their libraries. Hosting a respected scholar was like having a celebrity stay in your home today. But instead of selfies and autographs, the reward was access to discussions on philosophy, law, or astronomy, and of course bragging rights. My great-grandfather's manuscripts are older than your city council. The manuscripts themselves were beautifully crafted. Calligraphy was an art form, with elaborate geometric designs, decorative margins, and sometimes illustrations of everything from celestial maps to local flora. Paper was rare and precious, ink was carefully made from natural dyes, and the act of writing was often a meditative ritual. Each page was a statement. Knowledge is sacred, and its preservation is vital. Copying a manuscript could take weeks or months, with each transcription ensuring the survival of wisdom for future generations. Timbuktu's manuscripts also reflected the city's global connections. Scholars often copied texts brought from North Africa, the Middle East, and even beyond. Mathematics from Egypt, astronomy from the Islamic world, medical texts from Persia. These works were adapted, expanded, and taught in Timbuktu's classrooms. The city became a melting pot of intellectual traditions where African, Arab, and occasionally European knowledge converged. Families who safeguarded these texts weren't just protecting books, they were protecting an intellectual bridge across continents. Trade and wealth were part of the story too. Manuscripts sometimes functioned as collateral in financial dealings. A wealthy merchant could offer a particularly rare text as a guarantee for a loan or as part of a dowry. Unlike gold, manuscripts didn't melt, tarnish, or get stolen easily if well hidden. But they could still be lost to carelessness or war. Families developed meticulous cataloging systems to keep track of what they owned. Some manuscripts were numbered, others annotated with notes about provenance, and many contained the family's signature seal, a mark that said, "This belongs to us, and we intend to keep it safe." The humor of it is that these manuscripts, sometimes thousands of pages long, were handled with extreme reverence, but most people outside Timbuktu had no idea they existed. Travelers might walk past mud brick houses, see ordinary courtyards, and never guess that within lay hundreds of priceless texts. These were hidden treasures of knowledge, quietly shaping a city's intellectual life, while the outside world assumed Timbuktu was only a dusty trading post in the middle of nowhere. Yet, the manuscript culture also fostered a deep sense of responsibility. Knowledge was power, but it was also fragile. Families taught their children to respect books, handle them carefully, and seek to understand rather than just collect. Some households even developed training programs for young scribes, ensuring that the manuscripts would continue to be copied, read, and shared. In a sense, Timbuktu's families were both librarians and guardians, scholars and historians, all rolled into one. By the end of the day, these manuscripts were more than words on paper. They were the lifeblood of a city that had learned the true meaning of wealth. Gold could fade, salt could dissolve, and caravans could be lost. But manuscripts, with careful hands and a little luck, they could outlive empires. And so Timbuktu's legendary libraries and hidden collections ensured that centuries later, the world would still remember a city where knowledge was cherished, protected, and yes, occasionally inherited, instead of grandma's jewelry. All great cities have their rise, and Timbuktu's golden era, full of gold, salt, and scholarly manuscripts, was no exception. But even the brightest stars eventually dim, and for Timbuktu, the combination of shifting trade patterns and foreign invasions slowly snuffed out its brilliance. The decline didn't happen overnight. It was a series of subtle blows that transformed the city from a bustling hub of global commerce into a quieter, wistful memory of its former glory. The first significant shift came not from war, but from the changing currents of trade. For centuries, Timbuktu thrived because desert caravans were the arteries of commerce. Gold, salt, ivory, and manuscripts flowed through the city, feeding both wealth and knowledge. But as the 15th and 16th centuries progressed, coastal trade began to eclipse the desert routes. European ships, sailing down the western coast of Africa, could transport goods faster, in larger quantities, and without the risk of sandstorms, bandits, or dehydrated camels. Merchants who once relied on Timbuktu's markets started to bypass the city, choosing ports in modern-day Senegal, Ghana, and Morocco instead. For Timbuktu, this shift was like losing the main highway in a town built entirely around traffic. Traders, scholars, and artisans noticed the decline in visitors and opportunities. Caravans became smaller, markets quieter, and wealth trickled away. Families that had once controlled massive fortunes of gold and salt began to see their influence wane. Buildings that had housed scholars and merchants grew dusty. Courtyards once alive with debate and commerce started to echo with the sound of the wind, rattling the occasional camel bell. Think of Timbuktu like an old blockbuster store, once the coolest hangout in town. Then suddenly, Netflix showed up, and the crowds vanished. The second, more violent blow came in 1591, when Moroccan forces invaded. Morocco had long eyed the wealth of the Mali Empire, and Timbuktu, with its reputation as a center of riches and learning, was a tempting target. The invasion was swift and brutal. Moroccan troops equipped with firearms that were still relatively new to West Africa overwhelmed local defenses. Wealth was seized, manuscripts looted or burned, and families who had once lived in prestige were scattered. The Moroccan conquest marked a turning point. Timbuktu would never fully recover its former stature. The aftermath was not just economic but psychological. Scholars fled or were forced into obscurity, trade networks were disrupted, and the city's role as a global intellectual hub diminished. The libraries that had once been carefully guarded became vulnerable. Some manuscripts survived, hidden by devoted families, while others were lost forever. Timbuktu's golden age of knowledge had ended, replaced by a quieter, more insular period where survival took precedence over scholarly debate. Interestingly, even in decline, Timbuktu retained a certain mystique. Stories of its wealth, gold-laden streets, and legendary libraries continued to circulate in Europe and the Arab world. Travelers arrived expecting a city of unimaginable riches, only to find mud brick buildings, smaller markets, and fewer scholars than legend suggested. Yet these visitors couldn't ignore the aura of history. The city had left an indelible mark on the imagination of the world, a reminder of what once was, even if reality no longer matched the legend. The decline also prompted changes within the city itself. Families who had previously relied on trade income turned inward, focusing on preserving what knowledge and wealth remained. Manuscripts were hidden in even more creative ways, sometimes buried or concealed behind false walls. local leaders prioritized defense and diplomacy, understanding that the city's survival depended less on wealth and more on resilience and adaptability. Timbuktu became quieter, yes, but it was far from dead. Its cultural and intellectual traditions persisted, albeit on a smaller scale. Yet decline didn't erase the ingenuity that had defined Timbuktu. Scholars continued to teach, merchants still traded, and the city's networks, though diminished, remained influential in regional contexts. Timbuktu became a symbol of endurance, the idea that even when empires move on, the imprint of culture, knowledge, and human achievement can linger for centuries. The city's story reminds us that decline is rarely sudden or total. It's a gradual reshaping, a transition from prominence to persistence, where survival becomes a form of quiet heroism. So while Timbuktu's streets no longer buzzed with the same intensity, and its marketplaces were quieter than in its heyday, the city remained a repository of history, culture, and human ambition. Gold may have flowed elsewhere, salt may have found new routes, and scholars may have fled, but Timbuktu survived. And that survival, even in quieter times, ensured that the city would continue to inspire stories, myths, and legends for centuries. In the end, the decline of Timbuktu was a lesson in impermanence, adaptation, and the shifting tides of commerce and politics. Wealth is fleeting, empires rise and fall, and trade routes change, but the human desire to create, preserve, and learn endures. Timbuktu may have been bypassed by ships and invaded by foreign powers, but it left behind a legacy far richer than gold alone could ever convey. For centuries, Timbuktu occupied a peculiar space in the world's imagination. To Europeans, it was almost mythical, a city of gold, knowledge, and desert mystique, so distant that maps often placed it vaguely at the edge of the known world. Travelers wrote of glittering streets, libraries overflowing with manuscripts, and markets where gold practically grew on trees. Some scholars doubted its existence entirely. Timbuktu was, in many ways, the medieval version of Area 51, whispered about, speculated on, and tantalizingly mysterious. The difference? It's very real, and less alien than you'd think. Fast forward to the 21st century, and Timbuktu has a far quieter reality than the legends suggest. It no longer bustles with camel caravans carrying gold and salt, or hosts scholars debating under shaded courtyards filled with 700,000 manuscripts. Yet, the city endures, tucked against the edge of the Sahara, a living monument to a glorious past. Its mud brick buildings, mosques, and narrow streets echo centuries of human ambition, learning, and survival. Walking through Timbuktu today, you might see locals going about their daily lives, children running past earthen walls, and the occasional dusty market stall. The city feels ordinary at first glance, but for those who know its story, every corner is steeped in history. One of Timbuktu's most remarkable achievements is the preservation of its manuscripts. Though not all 700,000 survived wars, invasions, and the ravages of time, tens of thousands remain carefully guarded. Families, libraries, and institutions work tirelessly to maintain these treasures, sometimes storing them in secret or specially designed spaces to protect them from humidity, theft, or the desert sands. The manuscripts continue to offer insight into centuries of scholarship, covering astronomy, medicine, theology, poetry, and law. For a city that has seen invasion, economic shifts, and cultural upheaval, these fragile sheets of paper are a defiant testament. Timbuktu's intellect survives. In 1988, they recognized the city as a World Heritage Site, acknowledging both its architectural and cultural significance. Timbuktu's mosques, including the famous Jingwe Bira Mosque, stand as examples of Sudano-Sahelian architecture, built from mud bricks with timber reinforcements and painstakingly maintained by local communities. The city's recognition is not merely symbolic. It has helped attract global attention and resources to preserve the manuscripts and infrastructure that remain. Tourists, researchers, and journalists now come from across the world to see the city that was once thought to be a mirage, walking streets where scholars debated and traders haggled centuries ago. Yet Timbuktu today is far from the bustling hub of the Mali Empire's golden age. Its economy is modest, reliant on local markets, small-scale trade and agriculture. Sandstorms still sweep through the streets, camels still wander the outskirts, and the Niger River continues to nourish the surrounding lands. The city's modern life feels like a quiet conversation with history. The grandeur of the past is present, but lived at a human, manageable scale. Visitors might be surprised to find that the legendary city of gold and knowledge is now a city of ordinary rhythms, where human resilience outshines ancient wealth. The myths of Timbuktu continue to capture imaginations. Books, films, and articles often emphasize the lost city of gold narrative, which is partly true but only a fragment of its story. Timbuktu's real allure lies in its ability to endure, to exist as a living city while simultaneously serving as a symbol of distant wonder. Europeans who doubted its reality, travelers who braved the desert, and historians piecing together manuscripts all contribute to a shared fascination that endures today. It is, in essence, both a tangible place and a concept, a testament to human ambition, intellect, and the allure of the unknown. For locals, Timbuktu is more than a legend. It is home, layered with centuries of culture, family histories, and community life. Children run past earthen walls that have stood for hundreds of years, learning their city's history not from textbooks but from lived experience. The manuscripts, preserved against the odds, continue to inspire new generations, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of the city remains alive, even if the wealth and grandeur of the Mali Empire are long gone. So, what is Timbuktu today? It is a paradox, simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, quiet yet historically explosive, a city of memory rather than immediate spectacle. For centuries, people doubted Timbuktu even existed, like a medieval Area 51, but it's very real and less alien than you'd think. Its streets, manuscripts, and mud brick mosques remain, bridging the gap between myth and memory. Timbuktu is no longer the glittering epicenter of trade and scholarship it once was, but it is something just as precious, a place where history breathes, stories endure, and the spirit of a golden city continues to inspire the world. In the end, Timbuktu survives as both city and legend, a reminder that even when empires fade, knowledge and culture can endure. It may no longer host grand caravans or the richest man in history, but the city's legacy persists, quietly defying time and expectation. And if you happen to wander its sandy streets today, you might just feel the weight of centuries underfoot, along with the very human sense that history, like sand, shifts but never entirely disappears. Imagine living in the early 1600s. The streets are bustling with merchants, scholars are hunched over manuscripts, and the sky, well, the sky is a distant, mysterious ceiling. Stars twinkle like tiny holes in a vast black tent. Planets are wandering specks, and the moon, smooth and perfect in everyone's imagination, the ultimate celestial cookie. Nobody had thought to look closer, until a few inventive minds in Holland decided that maybe, just maybe, a pair of lenses could make faraway things a little less mysterious. The year is 1608, and Hans Lippershey, a spectacle maker from Middelburg, is tinkering in his workshop. Like any good spectacle maker, he knows a thing or two about lenses, convex, concave, curved glass, but he has bigger dreams than just correcting grandma's far-sightedness. Legend has it that Lippershey noticed how combining two lenses made distant objects appear larger, clearer, and more impressive than ever before. Suddenly, the rooftops across town weren't blurry blobs, ships on the horizon looked impressively detailed, and cats prowling 3 streets away could be watched with scientific precision. Before the telescope, the only way to spy on your neighbor was very politely or very illegally. Now you could do it from your own window, completely above suspicion. Lippershey's invention was deceptively simple yet revolutionary. It consisted of a tube with a convex and concave lens at either end, cleverly aligned to magnify distant objects. It was like giving humanity a new pair of eyes, eyeballs with a little extra oomph. When Lippershey demonstrated his invention to local officials, they immediately saw its military potential. Imagine a Dutch admiral squinting through a telescope, spotting enemy ships before they got close enough to say ahoy. Suddenly, this little optical device wasn't just a curiosity, it was a game changer. Of course, Lippershey wasn't alone in tinkering with lenses. Spectacle makers across Europe were experimenting, sometimes without realizing they were standing on the brink of a cosmic revolution. There was Jacob Metius, another Dutch optician, who filed a patent around the same time. Some say his designs were very similar to Lippershey's, leading to a classic case of who invented it first. The argument is reminiscent of modern tech disputes, except instead of billion-dollar lawsuits, you had a lot of polite letter writing and suspicious glances over workbenches. And of course the occasional exaggerated tale that one inventor had already spotted the moon's craters before the other even got the lenses aligned. The beauty of the early telescope wasn't just its technical wizardry, it was the way it allowed ordinary people to experience the world differently. Farmers could spot approaching storms, sailors could navigate with new confidence, and city dwellers could inspect architectural details on buildings far across town without leaving their cobblestone streets. Even for the casual observer, it opened a window to wonder. Suddenly, things that seemed tiny, distant, or insignificant became visible in ways that sparked curiosity and awe. The telescope was not just a tool, it was an invitation to pay attention, to see, to wonder, to imagine. And yet the early telescopes were far from perfect. Lenses were small, the tubes wobbled, and distortions made distant objects look a little surreal. Trees could appear bent, ship masts seemed to dance on the horizon, and townsfolk could mistake distant goats for invading armies. But imperfections were part of the charm. They forced users to squint, lean closer, and really engage with what they were seeing. Early telescope enthusiasts quickly learned patience, careful observation, and occasionally the art of apologizing for pointing their devices at unsuspecting neighbors. Perhaps most importantly, the invention of the telescope marked a turning point in human curiosity. People had always looked at the sky, but never before had they had the tools to examine it closely. The telescope was like handing humanity a magnifying glass for the cosmos. Suddenly, the moon wasn't just a glowing disk. It had mountains, valleys, and craters. Distant ships were no longer tiny shapes. They were complex, detailed constructions with sails, crews, and flags. The world became bigger, and at the same time strangely more intimate. Objects that were once inaccessible could now be studied, marveled at, and understood in a new way. The early years of the telescope were filled with experimentation, wonder, and a dash of spectacle-induced chaos. Some townsfolk were convinced that telescopes allowed you to see spirits or angels, while others used them for far less mystical purposes, spying, navigation, and the occasional friendly prank. They were instruments of science, curiosity, and inadvertently, human mischief. And in those first few years in Holland, as Lippershey and his fellow opticians tinkered with lenses, humanity's eyes were opened in a way that would forever change how we understand our world. So the next time you glance at a distant mountain, a ship on the horizon, or a squirrel in your neighbor's tree, remember this: it all began with a humble Dutch spectacle maker, a pair of glass lenses, and the audacious idea that maybe the universe was worth peeking at. Before that, people squinted, guessed, and sometimes lied to themselves about what they could see. After that, the sky was no longer a limit, it was an invitation. By the time Galileo Galilei got his hands on a telescope, the world was ready for a little chaos disguised as discovery. The year is 1609, and Galileo, an Italian polymath with a curiosity bigger than the Medici vault, hears about these Dutch optical gadgets making distant ships look close enough to grab. Being the kind of man who wouldn't leave a curiosity unexamined or a cosmic secret undiscovered, he decides to improve the design. He lengthens the tube, polishes the lenses, and manages to magnify objects 3 times more than the Dutch versions. Suddenly, Galileo wasn't just looking at rooftops or ships on the horizon. He was peering directly at the heavens, and what he found was shocking. The moon, that familiar glowing friend of poets and lovers, was not the smooth, perfect disk that had adorned so many sonnets. No, it was craggy, mountainous, and scarred with valleys and pits. Turns out the moon looked like a celestial version of a well-used cheese wheel. Galileo's sketches, complete with jagged peaks and shadowy valleys, ruined everyone's romantic expectations. Turns out the moon isn't smooth. Galileo just ruined everyone's idea of romantic evenings, as modern astronomers might joke. People had imagined serenades beneath a flawless lunar glow. Instead, Galileo offered detailed topography that made candlelit walks slightly less enchanting but astronomically fascinating. But Galileo didn't stop at the moon. Jupiter, previously just another twinkling point in the night sky, revealed a secret of its own. Moons, 4 of them, dancing around the gas giant like celestial ballerinas, completely invisible to the naked eye. Suddenly, the idea that all heavenly bodies revolved around the Earth, a belief held dearly for centuries, was challenged. If Jupiter had moons orbiting it, maybe, just maybe, Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Galileo's telescope, that clever little tube of lenses, had given humanity a cosmic wake-up call. The universe was more complex, bigger, and less geocentric than anyone had comfortably assumed. Even the sun, that daily giver of warmth and frustration in summer, revealed unexpected secrets. By using a special filter and a lot of bravery, one glance at the sun could blind you permanently. Galileo observed dark spots moving across its surface. Sunspots, he concluded, showed that even the sun had imperfections and changes over time. Perfection was out. Motion and variability were in. Scholars and theologians alike struggled to reconcile these findings with long-held beliefs of a flawless, orderly cosmos. For some, the telescope had turned the heavens from divine art into a messy, working machine. Galileo's observations were met with equal parts awe and skepticism. While the scientifically curious applauded the precision and detail, the traditionalists, those who preferred their Aristotle with a side of certainty, were less impressed. "You're telling me the moon has mountains, the sun isn't perfect, and Earth isn't the center?" they muttered, clutching their manuscripts in disbelief. Galileo, never one for subtlety, kept pointing the telescope skyward, documenting every new discovery, sketching moons and mountains with the meticulous patience of someone who clearly enjoyed proving people wrong. The drama wasn't just celestial, it was social and political. Galileo's telescope became a symbol of the clash between observation and tradition. Before him, astronomy was mostly philosophical musing, reasoned speculation about the perfect heavens. Now you could point a telescope, make careful measurements, and literally prove theories wrong. Knowledge became empirical rather than purely doctrinal, and suddenly the universe felt less like poetry and more like evidence-based science. Galileo's telescope was less a toy and more a truth machine, and it made the heavens feel uncomfortably personal. Humor naturally followed human reactions. Friends, family, and students watching Galileo squint through his telescope might have muttered about his eccentricity. The man was giddy with excitement, jumping between sketches, charts, and diagrams, and yet the discoveries were undeniable. Moon craters, Jupiter's moons, sunspots, they were all there, waiting for someone brave enough to look. Galileo didn't just observe the universe, he redefined humanity's place within it. The cosmos, once a distant and untouchable perfection, suddenly had texture, motion, and, dare we say, personality. Perhaps most importantly, Galileo's work marked a turning point in scientific thinking. He demonstrated that observation could trump assumption, that evidence mattered more than doctrine, and that curiosity, combined with ingenuity, could literally shift humanity's perspective. A telescope wasn't just a tool, it was a bridge between imagination and reality. Ordinary people, and later, astronomers, philosophers, and curious minds everywhere, could see that the universe was no longer a flat, predictable stage. It was vast, messy, and waiting to be explored. So, when you gaze at the moon tonight, remember Galileo. He didn't just bring it into focus, he made it real. He taught us to question what we see, to challenge assumptions, and to find wonder in the rough edges of reality. The telescope had made the universe personal, intimate, and irresistibly fascinating, and for the first time in human history, looking at the night sky was more than an act of admiration. It was an act of discovery, adventure, and occasionally cosmic mischief. By the early 17th century, the telescope had begun its quiet revolution, but it was about to go from a clever curiosity to a cosmic revelation. Galileo had already proven the moon wasn't a flawless orb, and that Jupiter had moons of its own, but the universe had more surprises waiting. Soon, the act of looking became an act of discovery, and the night sky transformed from a glittering wallpaper into a complex stage full of celestial drama. One of the most mesmerizing feats of early telescopic astronomy was mapping the moon in unprecedented detail. Before the telescope, astronomers and philosophers had imagined the lunar surface as a smooth, perfect sphere, ideal for poetry, romance, and philosophical musings. But now every crater, ridge, and valley could be traced and sketched. Galileo, ever meticulous, spent hours observing the lunar landscape, documenting shadows cast by mountains and plotting their relative height. It was like discovering an entirely new world in our own cosmic backyard. Amateur astronomers and curious nobles alike could now peer through their small, shaky tubes and realize that the moon was a rugged, fascinating place, far more interesting than the polished versions in their imaginations. People began to understand that the celestial bodies weren't idealized ornaments. They were real, physical places with features and quirks waiting to be studied. Saturn, too, revealed a secret that had been hidden for centuries. When astronomers first pointed telescopes toward the planet, they noticed strange appendages, what we now know as Saturn's rings. Early observers struggled to describe them. Were they handles? Discs? Some thought Saturn might be wearing celestial bracelets. The initial sketches were often confused, showing Saturn with wings, ears, or even horns, but these crude drawings were the beginning of a deeper understanding. Planets were not mere points of light. They had shape, structure, and an almost theatrical presence in the heavens. Galileo himself glimpsed Saturn's rings but lacked the optical clarity to see them precisely. Still, it was enough to spark debate, speculation, and the inevitable astonishment of anyone peering through his telescope, and the planets weren't done with their surprises. As telescopes improved, astronomers discovered new planets and noted the subtle motions of stars, which had once seemed fixed and immutable. Constellations were no longer just poetic shapes. They were patterns in a dynamic sky full of movement. The fixed stars were found to be part of an immense universe, each with its own mysteries and potential companions. Stars weren't tiny pinholes in a cosmic tent. As generations had believed, they were faraway suns, each a possible anchor for planets, moons, or even other forms of life. Galileo basically pulled back the curtain and said, "Surprise," revealing a universe far richer and more complex than anyone had imagined. Of course, not everyone was ready for this cosmic unveiling. The scientific community, though intrigued, was skeptical. Scholars debated every detail. Was the moon really mountainous, or was Galileo imagining shadows? Were Jupiter's moons truly orbiting the planet, or were they optical illusions? Was Saturn wearing rings, or had someone mislaid a telescope lens? Letters flew between universities, arguments were scribbled in margins, and coffee-fueled debates continued long into the night. The skepticism wasn't just stubbornness, it was the natural caution of a world grappling with the fact that centuries of accepted knowledge might be, quite literally, upside down. Meanwhile, for the general public, telescopic observations were a source of wonder, fear, and occasional mischief. Townsfolk who caught a glimpse of distant moons or the Saturnian appendages often mistook them for omens or portents. Peasants might whisper about strange lights in the sky, while scholars tried to assure them it was just science, not divine intervention. And yet, the telescope's revelations were difficult to ignore. Even the most traditional thinkers had to squint through the eyepiece and admit that yes, the universe was stranger, bigger, and far more dynamic than their textbooks suggested. Humor naturally arose from these discoveries. People had spent millennia imagining the heavens as perfect and orderly, only to be confronted with rugged lunar surfaces, moons dancing around distant planets, and Saturn sporting its mysterious rings. It was like expecting a quiet library and finding a cosmic circus. Early observers often drew whimsical interpretations: planets with hats, moons with craters shaped like faces, and stars arranged like scattered confetti. The telescope made the universe both comprehensible and delightfully unpredictable. Perhaps the greatest legacy of this period was the shift in perception. No longer was the sky a static backdrop for human imagination. It became a laboratory, a playground, and a canvas for inquiry. The act of observation, aided by the telescope, taught patience, careful attention, and a sense of humility. The cosmos was vast, and humanity was only beginning to understand its scale and complexity. Each new star, planet, or moon became a reminder that seeing is believing, and that believing is the first step toward knowledge. By the end of this era, telescopes had revealed a universe full of drama, surprises, and wonder. The moon was rugged, Jupiter had its moons, Saturn wore rings, and stars twinkled not as fixed holes but as distant suns. Science had transformed the heavens from a decorative canopy into a dynamic, observable realm. And for those who looked through the lenses, the universe was no longer an abstract idea. It was personal, tangible, and irresistibly fascinating. By the time telescopes had revealed rugged moons and planetary rings, the world of astronomy had transformed from a quiet pursuit of curiosity into a highly competitive spectacle. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to merely look at the sky. You needed the right tools, the right support, and sometimes a royal endorsement to back your celestial ambitions. Kings, queens, and wealthy patrons quickly realized that telescopes were more than scientific instruments. They were symbols of prestige, power, and intellectual superiority. In the courts of Europe, telescopes became the ultimate status symbol. A monarch with access to a skilled astronomer and a finely crafted telescope could claim cosmic insight over rivals. Observing Jupiter's moons or Saturn's rings wasn't just about science, it was about showing off. Imagine a prince leaning over a polished brass telescope and announcing, "Behold, I can see moons you didn't even know existed." That statement, while factual, was also a bold flex in the intellectual hierarchy of the time. Wealthy patrons were willing to pay handsomely for instruments that were finely tuned, beautifully decorated, and capable of magnifying celestial objects far beyond what amateur lenses could manage. In many ways, telescopes became the medieval equivalent of luxury cars, intricate, expensive, and a guaranteed way to make neighbors jealous. This era also gave rise to one of the most dramatic aspects of early modern science: rivalry. Astronomers across Europe were in fierce competition to make the next big discovery. Letters and pamphlets flew between Venice, Florence, Paris, and London, each scholar claiming new celestial findings and questioning the authenticity of their peers' observations. Some debates were entirely scientific, focusing on calculations, positions, and careful sketches of planetary motions. Others were delightfully petty, like arguing over who first spotted a faint star or correctly interpreted Saturn's rings. Science, it seemed, had an ego problem. Royalty played a pivotal role in these rivalries. In many cases, an astronomer's survival, both financially and socially, depended on securing a patron. Galileo, for instance, was keenly aware of the advantages of aligning himself with powerful supporters, most notably the Medici family. By dedicating his discoveries to the Medici, he not only ensured financial backing, but also created a clever marketing campaign. The moons of Jupiter were renamed the Medicean stars, immortalizing the family in the night sky. It was early branding at its finest. Forget sculptures or portraits, the Medici now had celestial real estate. Other astronomers quickly realized the value of patronage, and telescopes became both tools of discovery and instruments of social climbing. But it wasn't just wealthy nobles fueling the telescope wars. Skilled craftsmen and lens makers also saw opportunities to rise to fame, or at least profit handsomely. Precision lenses were in high demand, and artisans competed to create the clearest, most magnifying instruments. Towns became centers of optical innovation, with workshops filled with grinding wheels, polishing cloths, and glass that reflected not only sunlight, but also ambition. The telescopes themselves evolved rapidly. Longer tubes, improved lens alignment, and more intricate designs became the norm. Owning a cutting-edge telescope was like holding a scientific trophy, proof that you were at the forefront of human curiosity. Meanwhile, the rivalries among scientists weren't purely local, they were international. Scholars exchanged letters, journals, and sketches, sometimes politely, often pointedly, with subtle digs at each other's competence. One astronomer might claim to have discovered a comet, only for another to announce they'd seen it first, or perhaps to suggest that the comet was actually a smudge on the telescope lens. Disagreements could escalate, reputations could rise or fall, and the race to the stars was as much about wit and presentation as it was about observation. There was a certain thrill in knowing that the night sky was not only vast and mysterious but also a stage for human ego, ambition and rivalry. Humor naturally emerged from these competitive antics. Imagine a gathering of astronomers showing off their telescopes like they were swords or musical instruments. "Mine can see moons you didn't even know existed" was more than a boast. It was a challenge, a boast and a status symbol rolled into one. Observations were shared with flourish, accompanied by carefully drawn sketches and detailed charts, and often with just a touch of dramatics. Some rivalries even turned comical, with astronomers mocking each other's instruments, claiming that poor craftsmanship led to phantom moons or wandering stars. Despite the occasional insult, or perhaps because of it, these rivalries accelerated the pace of discovery, pushing telescopic innovation forward at a remarkable rate. In the end, this combination of royal patronage, skilled craftsmanship, and scientific rivalry transformed the telescope from a curious optical toy into a powerful instrument of knowledge and prestige. It demonstrated that discovery was not just a solitary pursuit. It thrived in a social, competitive, and highly human environment. Observing the universe became an activity that combined intellect, ambition, and a healthy dose of one-upmanship. The telescope wasn't just about seeing distant planets or mapping moons. It was about staking a claim in the cosmos, impressing patrons and securing a place in the annals of history. By the mid-17th century, telescopes had become central to both scientific inquiry and social status. They were tools of exploration, instruments of prestige, and vehicles for intellectual rivalry. And while the sky remained vast, mysterious, and full of unknowns, humanity was now peering through finely crafted lenses, challenging old ideas, and turning the act of observation into an elaborate competitive spectacle. It wasn't just science, it was the original space flexing. By the early 17th century, telescopes had transformed from curious gadgets into powerful tools that could reveal the secrets of the heavens. But as is often the case when humans gain new knowledge, not everyone welcomed the revelations with applause. Suddenly, the act of pointing a telescope at the sky became controversial, unsettling, and for some, downright dangerous. While some admired the beauty and ingenuity of the instrument, others saw it as a threat to established authority, religious doctrine, and the carefully constructed order of the cosmos. Telescopes challenged long-held beliefs about the universe in ways that made the authorities nervous. For centuries, the prevailing view was geocentric. Earth was the center of creation, the fixed point around which the sun, moon, stars, and planets revolved. This model wasn't just a scientific theory. It was deeply intertwined with religious teachings and societal structures. The cosmos had a moral hierarchy as well as a physical one, and humanity occupied a privileged position at the center of it all. The telescope, however, revealed a universe that was far more dynamic, irregular, and impersonal than anyone had imagined. Jupiter's moons orbiting a distant planet, sunspots marking changes on the sun, and mountains on the moon all suggested that the heavens were not flawless, unchanging, or geocentrically obedient. To some, this was blasphemy disguised as science. Galileo Galilei, who had already earned fame and admiration for his discoveries, became the most infamous example of the perils of telescopic observation. His improvements to the telescope and his meticulous observations brought the heliocentric theory that the Sun, not Earth, was at the center of the solar system into sharp focus. While Galileo was careful to frame his work as empirical observation, his findings directly contradicted the teachings of the Church. And in an era when science and religion were deeply intertwined, challenging the cosmic order could quickly become a dangerous endeavor. Point a telescope at the sky, and suddenly people think you're summoning demons or at least plotting theological heresy. Galileo's troubles with the Church escalated as his discoveries spread across Europe. Religious authorities accused him of contradicting scripture, and he was eventually summoned to Rome to defend his ideas. Imagine a man who spent countless nights mapping moons, sketching sunspots, and observing planetary motions being interrogated in dimly lit chambers by clerics more concerned with orthodoxy than optics. The tension between curiosity and authority was palpable. Galileo tried to balance respect for the Church with unwavering commitment to observation, but the stakes were high. Accusation of heresy was not a casual warning. It could mean imprisonment or worse. The backlash against telescopic discoveries wasn't limited to Galileo. Across Europe, a mixture of awe, fear, and superstition colored reactions to the new instrument. Some ordinary citizens who had little understanding of the mechanics behind telescopes associated them with magical or demonic powers. Stories circulated of astronomers being able to see the heavens too clearly, or of telescopes revealing things humans were never meant to witness. Folktales imagined instruments as portals to otherworldly realms, and occasionally astronomers were treated with suspicion akin to witches or sorcerers. A telescope could make you a hero in one city and a heretic in the next. Despite the danger and superstition, some clever astronomers found ways to navigate this minefield. They framed discoveries in ways that minimized theological conflict, emphasizing observation over interpretation, or dedicated their work to powerful patrons who could offer protection. Galileo, for instance, skillfully named Jupiter's moons after the Medici family, simultaneously honoring his benefactors and keeping their political support firmly on his side. Still, the underlying tension remained. The telescope had revealed a universe that no longer fit neatly into the doctrines that had governed society for centuries. Humor, of course, emerged even in these tense moments. Imagine an astronomer cautiously pointing a telescope skyward while a neighbor whispers, "Are you sure that's just Jupiter and not a demon?" Or a cleric peering through the same lens and muttering, "I swear I see unholy movement among the stars." The telescope became a source of both fascination and anxiety, a tool that could inspire wonder one moment and fear the next. It was the ultimate double-edged sword. Enlightenment in one hand, controversy in the other. Ultimately, the dark side of observation highlighted an enduring human truth. Knowledge is never neutral. Every discovery challenges assumptions, reshapes power structures, and occasionally terrifies those invested in the old order. The telescope forced humanity to confront the vastness, complexity, and imperfection of the cosmos, and not everyone was ready for that reality. It also forced scientists like Galileo to navigate politics, theology, and public opinion with the same care they applied to their observations of moons and stars. In the end, the telescope didn't just expand our vision of the universe, it expanded our understanding of human nature. Curiosity could inspire brilliance, but it could also provoke fear, jealousy, and outright hostility. Galileo's struggles remind us that discovering the truth is rarely straightforward, and that peering too deeply, whether at the heavens or at society, can invite scrutiny, suspicion, and scandal. And yet, for all the tension and superstition, the telescope endured, proving that even in the face of opposition, the pursuit of knowledge has a stubborn, irrepressible way of shaping our understanding of the world, and occasionally giving us a good cosmic laugh along the way. After Galileo and his fellow early astronomers opened humanity's eyes to the wonders of the cosmos, the telescope's story didn't stop at small handheld devices. In fact, The journey of the telescope is a tale of escalating ambition, innovation, and occasionally absurd engineering. The early instruments were charming but limited: short tubes, wobbly lenses, and a magnification that made distant rooftops look impressive, but still left planetary details fuzzy. It didn't take long for inventors to realize that if small lenses could reveal so much, bigger lenses and eventually mirrors could reveal far more. Thus began the era of telescopes that made earlier instruments look like children's toys. By the mid-17th century, Dutch and English opticians were pushing the boundaries of lens size and tube length. Refracting telescopes, the kind Galileo had used, became longer and more powerful, sometimes stretching dozens of feet. The logistics were challenging. Early astronomers had to balance on scaffolds, prop up tubes with ropes and pulleys, and contend with the fact that a gust of wind could turn your prized telescope into an expensive spear. One can imagine the scene: a man in a long cloak clutching a telescope that is half as tall as a small building, peering desperately at Jupiter while trying not to topple over. Humor aside, these instruments were incredible leaps forward, allowing astronomers to map stars, observe planetary motions in real detail, and refine our understanding of celestial mechanics. However, refracting telescopes had a limitation. Lenses bend light imperfectly, producing a phenomenon called chromatic aberration. Essentially, colors would blur, and images weren't perfectly sharp. The solution came in the form of reflecting telescopes, pioneered by Isaac Newton in the late 17th century. Newton realized that mirrors rather than lenses could gather and focus light without the same distortions. His invention, the Newtonian reflector, revolutionized observational astronomy. It allowed for clearer, sharper images of the moon, planets, and distant stars, and it laid the groundwork for the giant observatories of the future. Newton's approach was elegant, ingenious, and, as his contemporaries noted, terrifyingly effective. For the first time, telescopes were not just tools. They were precision instruments capable of revealing the universe with unprecedented clarity. As telescope technology progressed, observatories began to spring up across Europe. Large refracting and reflecting telescopes were housed in purpose-built buildings, often with rotating domes and elaborate mountings. These instruments were no longer portable. They were architectural statements, monuments to human curiosity. Telescopes got so big that astronomers basically needed a small apartment just to see the stars. Some observatories featured ladders, platforms, and sliding roofs, because even a small shift in height could dramatically change what the telescope revealed. Observatories became centers of scientific collaboration, where astronomers could compare notes, sketch celestial objects, and refine calculations with a level of precision previously unimaginable. The evolution of telescopes also spurred international competition. Nations vied to build the largest, most precise instruments, both to advance science and to assert prestige. A massive telescope wasn't just a research tool, it was a statement of intellectual and technological superiority. For example, the great refractor at the Dorpat Observatory in the early 19th century was a marvel of engineering, combining optics, mechanics, and architectural ingenuity. To operate it, astronomers often had to coordinate teams, move scaffolding, and sometimes wrestle with the sheer weight of the lenses. The effort was immense, but the payoff was unparalleled, a window into the heavens like no other. Meanwhile, the basic principles of telescopic observation paved the way for space-based instruments centuries later. Before satellites and orbiting observatories, the largest telescopes were earthbound giants, grappling with atmospheric distortion, weather, and temperature fluctuations. Even with these challenges, telescopes were achieving feats that would have seemed magical to early Dutch opticians. They could detect distant nebulae, map star clusters, and track planetary orbits with remarkable accuracy. Each new generation of telescope built on the lessons of its predecessors: longer tubes, larger mirrors, better mounts, and sharper optics. Humor was never far behind these ambitious projects. Consider the absurdity of astronomers dangling ladders, peering through enormous tubes, and balancing precariously in observatory domes. Telescopes got so big, Astronomers basically needed a small apartment just to see the stars, became a running joke among scientific circles. Some designs were so unwieldy that operating the telescope required more skill than some of the celestial observations themselves. Yet the combination of ingenuity, determination, and occasional absurdity led to discoveries that fundamentally reshaped humanity's understanding of the universe. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, telescopes had evolved into incredibly sophisticated instruments. They could capture faint light from distant galaxies, measure stellar positions with extraordinary precision, and even hint at phenomena invisible to the naked eye. Observatories became temples of exploration, where light was bent, reflected, and magnified to reveal the deepest secrets of the cosmos. The journey from a small Dutch tube to massive reflecting telescopes showed that human curiosity, combined with clever engineering, could overcome limitations of scale, distance, and perception. In the end, the evolution of the telescope was a testament to ambition, creativity, and perseverance. From handheld lenses to massive observatories, telescopes allowed humanity to see further, think bigger, and dream bolder. They made the universe personal, tangible, and irresistibly fascinating, and they reminded everyone that when it comes to exploration, size, and a healthy sense of humor matters. If Galileo could see us now, he would probably drop his notebook in shock, or at least mutter a very loud, very Italian expletive. The humble telescope, which once allowed humans to glimpse the craters of the Moon and the moons of Jupiter, has evolved into a technological powerhouse capable of spying on galaxies billions of light-years away. What started as a polished tube of glass in 1608 is now a fleet of orbital observatories, advanced optics and instruments that transform the universe from an abstract concept into something nearly tangible. We've gone from backyard stargazing to cosmic surveillance, and yes, even time itself seems to get confused in the process. Space telescopes like Hubble, launched in 1990, revolutionized astronomy. No longer limited by the blurring effects of Earth's atmosphere, Hubble has provided crystal-clear images of nebulae, star clusters, and distant galaxies. For the first time, humans could see galaxies in exquisite detail, some of them billions of light-years away. Each photon captured was a message sent across the cosmos, arriving long after it had left its source. Hubble didn't just show us what was out there, it showed us when it happened. In some cases, we are literally looking back in time, glimpsing the universe as it was billions of years ago. Imagine that, a device in Earth's orbit allowing us to peer into the cosmic past while simultaneously questioning our dinner plans. Then came the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021. With its enormous gold-coated mirrors and infrared capabilities, it penetrates cosmic dust clouds, revealing star nurseries, exoplanets, and galaxies previously invisible to even Hubble. This telescope is so powerful that it doesn't just observe the universe, it practically eavesdrops on it. Scientists can study the chemical compositions of distant worlds, trace the formation of early galaxies, and detect phenomena so faint and far away that they seem almost magical. It's a far cry from the early telescopes that simply magnified rooftops and ships. In many ways, Webb has turned the act of observation into an exercise in cosmic detective work, sifting through the universe's hidden layers to reveal secrets that have existed for billions of years. Modern telescopes have also democratized astronomy in ways Galileo could never have imagined. High-powered instruments are no longer confined to royal courts or wealthy patrons. Amateur astronomers with modest backyard setups can track asteroids, observe lunar eclipses, and even capture images of distant nebulas. Citizen science projects allow enthusiasts to contribute to real research, from discovering new exoplanets to monitoring variable stars. The telescope, once a symbol of elite curiosity, has become a bridge connecting professional scientists and everyday stargazers. Backyard telescopes might not rival Webb, but they make the cosmos feel accessible, inspiring wonder in anyone who dares to look up. Beyond entertainment and research, telescopes have practical applications that are nothing short of cosmic spycraft. Earth-based and space-based telescopes monitor asteroids and comets that could pose a threat to our planet. Some telescopes detect subtle changes in planetary atmospheres, aiding the search for life beyond Earth. Others are used in satellite monitoring, tracking debris in orbit, and even assisting in military intelligence. The telescope has evolved from a tool for curiosity into a multi-purpose instrument of discovery, defense, and occasionally interstellar detective work. Humor naturally follows these advances. We've gone from spying on the moon with shaky lenses to peeking at galaxies so distant that even time gets confused. 1 minute, astronomers are watching star nurseries forming. The next, they're studying the light from a galaxy as it appeared billions of years ago, essentially reading a cosmic diary. Meanwhile, amateur stargazers in suburban backyards marvel at Jupiter's moons, oblivious to the fact that their casual observations are now mirrored by satellites peering across the universe. It's as if the universe has become a stage where everyone, kings, scientists, and hobbyists alike, gets a ticket to the front row. The telescope has not only expanded our vision but reshaped our understanding of our place in the cosmos. It has proven that Earth is one planet among billions, part of a vast dynamic universe governed by laws we can study, measure, and sometimes marvel at in awe. Our knowledge of black holes, dark matter, exoplanets, and galactic evolution all hinges on the simple principle Galileo stumbled upon. By observing, we can begin to understand, yet it's also a humbling reminder. For every galaxy we see, there are billions more, stretching the limits of imagination and technology. In the end, modern telescopes represent the culmination of centuries of curiosity, innovation, and relentless ambition. From a tiny Dutch tube to Hubble and James Webb, they have transformed the act of looking into a profound exploration of existence itself. And while they reveal the vastness and complexity of the universe, they also remind us of the joy, wonder, and occasional absurdity of peering into the unknown. After all, humanity's first telescope may have been a humble experiment, but today, our eyes and instruments reach across time and space, proving that no frontier is too distant, no mystery too vast, and no galaxy too far for the curious mind. And as we look upward tonight, perhaps with a backyard telescope or a high-resolution image on a screen, we can chuckle at the journey from spying on our neighbors' rooftops to eavesdropping on the universe itself. Curiosity has come a long way.